Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Vasto of White in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 56, Hero or Villain, Part 5. Right here, right now, there was nothing outside the boundary of this battle. The wind brushing over his face, the spiritual energy coalescing into the outline of a blade around him as his body transitioned into motes of white light, all of it had a single purpose. This was the final technique born from the act of giving up everything. The ultimate attack that defined who he was as a spirit. I will become the blade that severs the ties of vengeance and ends its karmic cycle. His name was Shinso, the sacred spear that slays the divine. The god-killing spear. Power welled around him as his eyes narrowed into slits. Half of his body had already faded by now and assimilated into a formless ether congregated into a point over the tip of his right hand. To all those staring at him, there was no pressure, nor presence. He was there, and yet not there, for he was no longer in the same realm of existence. Power, strength, ability, all that he was and ever will be converged as one. All he had was a single instance. A final attack. When he leveled his right hand forward and took aim, the world stilled before his eyes. There was no wind, nor color, or pattern to be seen. Everything had leveled out into a single plane. A bewitching twilight heralding the coming finality of the end. It was a white world, a static world without features. An unseen force permeated outwards. Although it couldn't be felt or detected, it was as if one was standing on the precipice of defeat. No one was an exception. Shinso focused on a target, his spiritual sense locking onto everyone on the battlefield, several of which immediately tensed. Aizen was one thing, as Kyuka Suijutsu could mess with his senses, but no one else had that capability. This strike would never miss its mark. Waiwak felt a wave of unease at Shinso's form, while Yamamoto and the other members of the Zero Squad raised their guards. Only Uratsunemeya, third officer of the Zero Division, reacted any differently. He was the creator of Zanpakuto, the forefather of all, able to sense any Zanpakuto he'd ever created and supplied to the Soul Society in a Sashi form. My baby, I made that. All sound become meaningless to Shinso. Do not speak, do not yell, for he could no longer hear. Only a single target existed before him, such was the nature of this strike and the breaking down of his spiritual body. Shinso wasn't aiming for Waiwak or any member of the Zero Squad. A part of him could infer that he could deal substantial damage to any of them, but he'd already locked onto the target of his immediate ire. Zanpakutos were merely the vessels in which half of a Shinigami's soul may reside. It was a container through and through. Therefore, the one person Shinso valued the most was the well-being of his master. It was true that they shared the same likes and dislikes, but Jin was Shinso's priority. To the one who struck his master, this strike would go. Leobaro, the X-axis of the Sternritter, suddenly felt the hairs on the back of his neck abruptly raise up in warning. Even from his distance away from the mysterious entity that abruptly appeared in combat, he felt small. Both of his eyes opened immediately, the strength of his shrift activating. The power granted to him by his lord allowed him the ability to pierce through anything in his line of sight, including attacks. This ability allowed him to phase through enemy strikes if he so wished. However, this was different. No matter how he tried to dispel the visible buildup of energy in front of him, nothing was working. You can't pierce what's not there. The visible sight of clouds and wind rippling around Shinso was not a product of his own creation, but the world reacting to his presence. Shinso's right hand raised forward and took aim as the last of his figure faded into motes of ether. I am the spear that strikes down the gods. As a Zanpakuto, Shinso was not known as the longest sword, but the fastest. The speed in which it could elongate and retract was second to none. The blade itself would fade into fragments of dust during its rapid acceleration, and the dust itself was the true weapon. A poison-inducing rapid cell degeneration. The final Shinso took everything to another level. A keening echo resounded as a ring of energy rippled through the skies of the Siriti as if a droplet impacting against still water. Shoot to kill. The concept of distance no longer mattered. It was irrelevant. All were rendered equal. A single thrust and the strike would land all the same. The hovering spear of white energy in the horizon shone brilliantly in the twilight. A fleeting radiance echoed by a softly whispered word. Sakurarane. An inescapable blow. A flash of light was all that could be seen, and then nothing. It was a strike that launched and ended in the same breath. There was no fanfare, nor dramatic finish. Everything before the spear's path remained unharmed, as the spear didn't exist within the laws of the world. Instead, it would only reveal its presence once stabbed through the body of its target, revealing its true nature in the form of poisoned dust. Koros, Kamishinai no Yari. Nothing remained in the spot Leelbaro once stood. A lull formed over the battlefield, one of stunned disbelief, as no one could understand just where Shinso had come from or the nature of its affiliation. Jin Ichimaru's features perked up in solemn thought as he felt Shinso's blade thrum in its sheath before growing silent. Any attempt at making contact with his Zanpakuto spirit ended in silence. He was stubborn and kept trying to reach for his connection with Shinso, but he was in no condition to continue. He grunted while doing his best to prevent Rangiku from discovering his wobbling knees. The bullet he'd been struck in the chest with had blown a hole the size of a melon near his heart. He was bleeding profusely, but his hold on Rangiku never waned as he navigated the dimensional passage between the Soul Society and the human world. In front of them was a hell butterfly that Jin would have no shame in claiming he'd pilfered from a dead Shinigami. He could be sly or deceitful, but he'd always been quick-witted. Neither he or Rangiku were in any condition to move, but anyone could see that Rangiku was less injured than him. When Rangiku pointed out the obvious and attempted to switch places, Jin gave her an uncharacteristically flat stare. For everything I've put you through, a little pain means nothing. Rangiku pursed her lips. She could wrestle herself free of Jin's hold, but that would mean easing the pressure she'd been putting on his chest to slow his bleeding. Damn it, Jin. A sheen of moisture covered her eyes while a haggard smile spread over Jin's. It would take a lot more than this to put me down. Just shut up. Talking required effort and Rangiku could see that Jin was already struggling as it was, so she maintained her silence. Using what little spiritual energy she'd regained, she began using a basic recovery Kido over Jin's chest. The two moved in silence, the darkness of the passage between dimensions illuminated only by the dim light of the hell butterfly. Jin's steps echoed while the erratic up and down motion of his torso caused him to cough constantly as his left lung had collapsed from the hole in his chest. He was wheezing, but strength never left the grip in which he held Rangiku. Rangiku looked up at Jin's face before her shoulders began to quiver. Jin was only half conscious and moving forward through the strength of his will alone. His mouth was moving as he muttered in a low voice difficult to hear. Jin had always been tight-lipped and secretive, but only she knew that his guard dropped in his sleep. Moreover, Jin was clearly delirious. Rangiku calmed her breathing and just listened. Always failing. The tapping of Jin's steps continued to resound. It was one promise. A single promise. What was Jin seeing right now? What was he imagining? His pupils were unfocused, but his body followed the hell butterfly regardless. Sorry, Rangiku. I still haven't taken back what was stolen from you. Just wait a little longer. A memory from long ago surfaced in Rangiku's mind. Jin had never once wished to be a Shinigami despite his talent, but then one day, he did a complete 180 and began to drift away from her. What happened on that day? What didn't she know? And then it all clicked like a bucket of ice water poured over her head. In her youth with Jin, there was one time where she was attacked by random Shinigami and left for dead. When she'd woken up, all she'd been able to see was Jin's blue eyes narrowed in determination. In vengeance. This was where it all started. It was her. She was the reason Jin had left. Aizen. Aizen. A single name was uttered from Jin's mouth and Rangiku felt as if she was seeing the Jin of her past for the first time in years. The thing was, he'd never changed from the boy who always looked after her in their childhood. Aizen must have been involved with the Shinigami who attacked her, but knowing Aizen, even Jin stood no chance in open confrontation. Like a snake, he'd bided his time, and betrayed his allies, all for a single opportunity. You planned to kill Aizen, Rangiku whispered out. Jin suddenly stopped muttering, Rangiku's voice snapping him out of his blood-loss-induced stupor. His gaze sharpened, but he made no indication of answering, but that alone was enough for Rangiku. You bumbling fool. Rangiku didn't have the heart to berate Jin for everything wrong he'd done just to get back at Aizen for her sake. Neither of the two made another noise, but Ranjika was sobbing inaudibly while holding Jin tightly in a hug. Why do you never ask me before you do anything stupid? Always leaving me behind without telling me anything. Jin solemnly walked forward, his expression set carefully blank while Ranjika let her frustration with him show. The feelings of wishing to protect someone precious wasn't something that could be explained logically anyway. It didn't matter what happened to you so long as the one you wished to protect remained safe. To this end, Jin swore that he'd never fail. Minutes passed before Jin entered the human world with one final step. The feel of the sun's rays on his skin and the sound of the humans going about their lives was all Jin needed to hear before he blacked out. The doorway between the Soul Society and the human world had opened in an empty alley over the ground. Right at the entrance of the doorway, Jin teetered towards the ground. "Hey wait, Jin. Jin." Ranjika immediately caught Jin before he could fall and supported him by wrapping his right arm over her shoulders. His blood loss had been stopped after some basic healing keto, but he'd still die if he didn't get medical attention. Jin was breathing heavily and less frequently, causing no end to Ranjika's worries. She dreaded to think about what condition her captain and the Soul Society was in right now, but Jin's life was the one at stake in front of her. Gritting her teeth, her knees buckled as she took on Jin's body weight and began to trudge onward with her injuries. There was one place in Karakara town that she knew had people that could help her, and it wouldn't be her first time visiting. She groaned while bending her knees and pushed off into the sky towards Kisuk's shop. Jin's head was resting over her shoulder and she didn't know how much longer the idiot could last before succumbing to his injuries. This thought made her push herself harder. She cared for Jin just as much as Jin did for her, to the point that she knew she could never kill him even if they were enemies. They'd had their misunderstandings and lack of communication, but this was the strength of their bond. "Hurry! Faster!" The slower Jin's breath became, the more frantic Ranjika grew. When her spiritual energy ran out on her, she plummeted with Jin to the ground where they trudged onward on foot. She'd been to Karakara enough times to be familiar with the path to Kisuk's shop that it didn't take her long to see the dinky thing hiding within a clearing in an alleyway. She hoped above all else that Orium was inside the shop. For a human, she had an astonishing ability to heal others with a power beyond simple regeneration. It was like she was turning back time, making injuries appear as if they'd never happened. Upon drawing close to the shop, Ranjika became aware of the distinct spiritual energies inside. A majority of them were massive, which wasn't too disconcerting considering Kisuk and Yoryuki were captain-class Shinigami, but she could sense more than two towering spiritual pressures inside. Hesitating only for a second, she barged in and headed directly to the underground facility she knew Kisuk had installed beneath his store. The problem was, the entire area was packed with such a dense spiritual energy that she momentarily reeled. She blinked and took in the faces that shifted towards her after she'd entered. Ranjika's eyes flashed in recognition as she began to list the large group of acquaintances in front of her. Ichibe, the leader of the Zero Squad. She'd seen him when she'd attended a captain's meeting with Toshiro in the 1st Division. Then there Kyokaku and Ganju Shiba sitting on their own by a corner. Karin and Ishine Kurosaka were standing cross-armed while Kisuk and Yoryuki were huddled over a device Kisuk was tinkering with. Ranjika's injured state caught everyone off guard. And then came the realization that she was carrying Jin Ichimaru over her shoulders, and this caused no small number of eyes to narrow in hostility. Ranjika swallowed nervously under the attention, but she couldn't falter here. She laid Jin gently on the ground and made eye contact with Kisuk. "I need help," she called. "He's going to die if he doesn't get medical aid." Kisuk grunted while placing a hand beneath his. He took a moment to stare before nodding towards Tessai, who Ranjika noticed was behind her. The air was tense, but Ranjika allowed Tessai to attend to Jin so that he wouldn't die. She bit down on her lips however when Tessai soon bound Jin in several high-level Hado spells that wrapped tightly around him. Handcuff-like energy chains dug into Jin's skin, forming a ringed discoloration while a white bandage stemming from 4 stakes in the ground wrapped him up like a mummy. "Why you don't have to be that rough with him," Ranjika mumbled when she watched the discomfort flash across Jin's face. She winced. "He is dangerous," Tessai said simply before adding on another layer of keto that trapped Jin in a square coffin with only his head showing. Ranjika held her tongue, and didn't resist as Tessai then went and helped treat her injuries. Sitting down, She watched as everyone focused their attention on her instead of whatever device Kisuk was fiddling with. As it would turn out, the function of the device soon became clear as it opened a Garganta to Hueco Mundo. Rangiku opened then closed her mouth in disbelief. While the Siridi was under siege, some of the Soul Society's strongest combatants were trying to infiltrate Hueco Mundo. It was ridiculous. No. Rangiku stopped herself from releasing an outburst. They probably had no idea about what occurred yet. Still, upon seeing the Garganta open, Kyokaku Shiba and his hind immediately started moving towards it. Never mess with a Shiba and their family. Kyokaku and his hind had relatives to rescue. Ichibe and Karen looked ready to follow. Ah, no wait, Rangiku reached a hand forward and called out, but her voice was overpowered by the effectiveness of someone else's. I wouldn't recommend going there. Jin blearily opened his eyes while panting for breath. Tessai's rough handling of him had jarred him into awareness. Groggy as he was, he'd always been quick to analyze a situation. Right now, isn't a time to be making more enemies. And I see one right in front of me. Kyokaku had been trying to keep her temper from flaring at Jin, but trying to stop her now was the same as goading her. You're one of Aizen's men. People who hurt her older brother. Why should we even be trusting anything you say? In a fit of anger, Kyokaku began marching towards Jin. Hey, stop, don't. He's right to warn you all. Though injured, Rangiku stood in front of Jin before Kyokaku could draw any nearer, fully intent on pushing herself if it meant Jin's safety. Kyokaku grunted, staring between Rangiku then Jin, then back. Warn us of what? Ganju spoke up curtly while Karen seemed hesitant on how to act. Kyokaku glared but knew better than to act too much on emotions. The Siridi. Kisuk inquired thoughtfully, a hand moving to shut off the Garganta he'd created. I assumed earlier this morning that the technical research facility was just undergoing maintenance, but I've lost connection with the Siridi for longer than normal. Can you try contacting them now? Ichibe proposed. Kisuk hummed and simply clicked a button on a radio communications transceiver Yoriyuki was holding that operated on spiritual energy. Nothing but static could be heard. Don't bother trying anymore, Rangiku took a shuddering breath. The Siridi's probably gone by now, she said bitterly, drawing mixed reactions. Kisuk and Yoriyuki frowned, while Ichibe maintained his calm. Karen and the Shiba siblings looked appalled. It was under siege when Jin came and rescued me, Rangiku elaborated. Jin did. Yoriyuki hummed and thought while Kisuk scrutinized Jin with a critical eye. From one genius to another, Jin merely gave a deceitful smile. Jin may not be as loyal to Aizen as you all may think. Rangiku shifted the topic. He dash. Siridi. The Siridi. You haven't finished explaining what happened yet. Who are the attackers, and how did they infiltrate the Soul Society? Ichibe interrupted with cool aloofness. He may seem calm on the surface, but a feeling of ill premonition was clamping a vice around his heart. His authority as the leader of the Zero Squad was out in full display. Quincy, Rangiku didn't beat around the bush and shifted her tone into a formal one. Veins popped over Ichibe's skin, a rare expression of urgency making its way over his generally jovial features. His hands grew clammy and a sharpness glinted over his eyes. Rangiku continued to report in a fluent manner. We're still not sure how they managed to sneak into the Siridi, but they spoke of their king's awakening before the attack. Their king. Kisuk echoed out. Rangiku stared everyone in the face and said only a single name heard from the mouths of the Quincy. Waiwak. And suddenly, Ichibe was gone through a danga, a storm of spiritual energy left in wake of his urgency. Over 900 years, he shall recover his heartbeat. Over 90 years, he shall recover his intellect. Over 9 years, he shall recover his power. The prophecy of the Quincy war song was about to come to pass. Time was of the essence. Death, ruin, then rebirth. This entire campaign was built upon this simple premise. To change a rotten world, one must first destroy it in order to build it anew, and destruction begins from the foundation. Waiwak had taken a single moment to assess the dynamics between Shinigami, Hollow, and Quincy, and deliberately began planning out the road to doomsday. 9 days, and he shall recover the world. At the moment of his waking, he was amused to discover the situation between the Hollows and Shinigami as reported by Hashwalth. The two sides had been through a large-scale confrontation with Yamamoto's forces taking the brunt of the damage. He'd sent Quilge, Giselle, and Lloyd to scout the situation in Hueco Mundo to ascertain the strength of their special war potential, but none had returned. In any case, Wywak had seen for himself about what sort of being the Vasto of White was, and concluded that he was no match at his current level. This caused him to rapidly speed up his plans to assimilate the strength of his bound father in the Soul King's palace. Only then could a true battle be fought. To that end, the Siraidi's fall was secondary. It was only better that the Shinigami were in a weakened state after their war. Wywak couldn't have been any more pleased that the Zero Squad decided to pay the Siraidi a visit in wake of the threat the Vasto of White posed. In doing so, they'd temporarily vacated their positions as the Soul King's royal guard with only a single means to return rapidly to the Soul King's palace via a cannon owned by the Shiba clan. A cannon which should be up in flames by now. With the cannon out of the way, the 72 barriers around the palace would hinder the squad's return. Wywak couldn't stop his mouth from pulling upward into a grin as he felt Bazby engulf the entire Shiba complex with his power. In comparison, he saw the faces of the Zero Squad pull taut into a grimace. Fools, Wywak no longer had any time to waste on them, nor Yamamoto. The man, and rival of the past, had grown weak in his adult age. All the ruthlessness was gone, traded away for complacency. After his Bankai had been stolen, he was nothing more than a toothless predator. As Bazby's flames fully engulfed the Shiba clan's cannon, half of the Zero Squad shifted priorities with Kiryu Hikaifun and Senjumaru Shudderer Flash stepping away in order to douse the fire. Yet did the two really believe that they could get past him? Wywak gathered a torrent of spiritual energy and formed a wall of it to impede Kiryu and Senjumaru's advance. There was nothing that could be done to stop the inevitable. The Royal Guard had blundered in putting too much attention on the Vasto of White. Wywak really would have to show his appreciation to the Vasto of White when they met in person. Perhaps he'd even grant an honorary position in his Reich if the Vasto of White was cooperative enough. In any case, just as he was getting ready to confront the Royal Guard and a weakened Yamamoto, the unspeakable occurred. An unknown entity abruptly took form out of nothing. One moment there was nothing, and in the next it was there, a spirit that emitted no source of power but was affecting the world around it. He watched in fascination as the being merely pointed a hand, and the connection that Wywak had with the leader of his Scoots Staffel or upper echelon vanished in an instant. In his very last moments, Wywak could feel that Leobaro himself couldn't understand what had happened. There wasn't even a body left, not a trace of anything. That was my baby. Daddy's proud. Wywak frowned while listening to Uritsu's exclamation. In any case, Wywak wasn't perturbed at Leel's defeat. In the end, those who live and those who die will be determined through his use of his holy selection Auswallen. At present, all that mattered was that his objective in the Siraidi was complete. With the distraction posed by the mysterious entity, Bazby's flames had already toppled the Shiba clan's cannon and compound. The members of the Royal Guard wouldn't be able to return to the Soul King's palace fast enough to impede him even if another method was available to them. There is no longer any point in remaining here, Wywak said flatly before raising his voice. Stern Ritter. Rally to your king. All across the Siraidi, the remaining Quincy still alive or slaughtering Shinigami paused in their actions and heeded Wywak's call as beams of light engulfed them all. Of the Shinigami captains left, 4 were heavily inured, 1 was dead, and the rest had grown mad in their grief and weakness. It was truly a pity. Wywak looked upon the Siraidi's devastation and grunted. If he wasn't pressed by the fact that his power was presently weaker than the Vasto of White's, he would have stayed in order to sack the Soul Society further. As it was, he'd have to make do with settling a personal vendetta before departing. Goodbye, Yamamoto. It happened before anyone could react. Wywak was stronger than a majority of the Zero Squad already, and with Yamamoto's Bankai in his possession, there was hardly anyone that could stop him. The biggest factor that allowed Wywak the freedom to do as he pleased was that Ichibe was strangely absent. He alone may have been able to pressure Wywak into passivity, but fate was a cruel mistress. Wywak lashed out with a sword of spiritual energy while Tenjiro and Uritsu tried to intervene. If you believe that any of you can stop me without Ichibe, "Then you're all mistaken," Waiwak scoffed before he bypassed the two members of the royal guard and appeared in front of Yamamoto. Yamamoto was a hardened veteran of many battles. He could determine the current difference between him and Waiwak, but the tradition-orientated leader of the Siridii would never surrender. He swung his sword down in an arc, the familiar flames that had once wreathed its blade no longer present. It was nothing more than a sturdy Asachi. Pathetic. Waiwaka's sword cut through Yamamoto's blade and bifurcated Yamamoto across the shoulders. A deathly silence spread throughout the Siridii before aggrieved shouts echoed as Yamamoto's body collapsed over the ground. The captain commander had been killed in battle. The blow this one acknowledgement gave the Siridii was enough to madden the Shinigami still alive, and enrage the royal guard who had known Yamamoto as a comrade since the past. Waiwak summoned a ray of spiritual energy to blast Yamamoto's body into ashes, but this was as far as he could go before Uratsu and Tenjiro attacked him. The thing was, none of their blows hit their target. A faint glow appeared in Waiwaka's eyes. His power, the Almighty, grants him the ability to peer into the possibilities of the future and mold them into the outcome he desires. Moreover, any power that he knows will become his ally and be unable to harm him in any way. He was Waiwak, the Almighty and slumbering king of the Quincy, and he will soon end the life and death cycle of the world. Until next time, Waiwak decreed as a pillar of spiritual energy enveloped him. Like the other members of the Stern Ritter, he stepped into a portal. However, his destination was different than his subordinates who retreated back towards the hidden stronghold of Wadenreich. The portal he had stepped into was less like a portal and more like an ejection shaft with explosives fueled by spiritual energy rigged at the bottom. With a thought, Waiwak was sent rapidly accelerating towards the sky. "Stop him!" The members of the royal guard present immediately understood what was happening, but had no method to intervene. "Revel in your despair, for the end times have come." Waiwaka's felt wind rapidly blowing over his form as he ascended towards the 72 barriers of the Soul King's palace high above the Siridii. There was no longer hole made from the Zero Squad's arrival, but it didn't matter as he'd long since made his preparations. The only method to access the Soul King's palace was through a key known as the Oaken made from the bones of a royal guard. This was so that one could survive passing through the 72 barriers of the palace. However, in the end, wasn't an Oaken just a congregation of energy and those that possessed the blood and bones of the Soul King? Waiwak himself as the son of the Soul King already possessed the qualification of blood and bones. All that was truly required of him was the power to endure the friction of the 72 barriers. He lifted both of his hands to his side and began to channel energy. Auswallen, he invoked the power of holy selection as beams of light shot down on many Sternritter and Wadenreich. Screams of confusion and anger reverberated through his mind, but their sacrifice would be their honor as contribution towards the greater good. Auswallen was the ability to steal the power of the Impure Quincy to bolster his strength and those he selects as worthy. In essence, it was the ability of redistribution. Spiritual energy swelled around Waiwak as he made contact with the 72 barriers and began his forceful ascent to his father's palace. Preparations had long since been made for his entry, and now that the palace was without its guards, there would be no one to stop him. The pieces of the board were shifting towards the final phase. Seconds turned into minutes. Waiwak released a shout of exertion as he broke into the Soul King's palace. Ha ha ha. He grinned widely. Blood was trickling down his skin and a majority of his clothes had been burnt black, but it didn't matter. There before him was the palace that bound his father. The dimension was divided into several layers stacked upon each other. The lowest layer consisted of many buildings similar in design to those in the Siridii with tiled roofs and white walls. From this, a wide staircase leading to an open plaza lined by rows of huge circular pillars. Floating above each pillar were numerous buildings. Between all the pillars, and floating even higher than the rest was cylindrical structure with a conical top and bottom. This was the inner sanctum of the Soul King's palace, the structure that restrained his father. The moment Waiwak arrived, his presence was immediately sensed by Senjumaru's divine soldiers. They all wore black hakama with purple sashes around their waist. Over their faces were black masks with 4 light-colored lines, and their hair was tied up into top knots. They were known as the Blades of the Soul King, and where there were blades, there would be shields. The realm trembled as various figures impacted over the plaza. They were the second-class divine soldiers known as the Shield of the Soul King. They were towering replicas of the standard divine soldiers, but they wore circular black hats. No one spoke. There was mutual understanding between them that neither side would back down, and words were useless in battle. The only thing that had to be understood here was that none of these divine soldiers could rival the power of a royal guard. Waiwak was just as strong if not stronger than Ichibei in terms of power. This setup was like sending ants to kill an elephant. Even if enough ants could topple a giant, there was no way the giant could be impeded as it moved. Waiwak began walking, slaughtering all of Senjumaru's divine soldiers that got in his way until he entered his father's inner sanctum reeking of blood. The inside was sparsely decorated and dim. All that could be seen was a figure whose limbs had been severed with only a body to remain trapped inside a barrier suspended by 4 wires. This was all that was left of the Soul King. Powerless, and nothing more than a tool to be used to maintain the balance brought on by the Soul Society's noble clans. "Did you foresee this day coming already, father?" Waiwak asked rhetorically. He already knew the answer. Slowly he approached, blade drawn. "I will put an end to this cycle of life and death, and bring about the vision of a better world." No answer. Of course, there wasn't an answer. Waiwak could predict the future, but even he couldn't see everything. Mimihagi's activities were still unknown, but the Soul King's death should force the king's right hand out of hiding. Raising his sword up, Waiwak slashed down without mercy, killing the Soul King and beginning the process of usurpation. Black shadows began to crawl up Waiwaka's arms while creating malformed abominations that fell towards the Siriti. Destiny calls. The true battle begins now. The Vasto of White would no longer be the only one with a world at his beck and call. The playing field would soon be even, but the parallels still existed. Waiwak and the Vasto of White. Each carried their own ideals, but only one ruler may exist. He who rules with an iron fist, or he who acts for the well-being of others. A tyrannical demon or a watchful god. Both had their sides and supporters, and the one decision the Soul Society would have in this conflict was who to support when neither option was appealing. In any case, Waiwak shut his eyes and focused. The power welling through his veins was overwhelming, such that it needed an outlet. He would fire the first shot. Waiwak activated the power of worldly assimilation to create a single battlefield, manually beginning the merging process between the human world, the Soul Society, and Hueco Mundo. Waiwak grinned as he felt resistance in the world's laws. "Your move." Hueco Mundo was transforming. Chapter 57. Well fuck. That was certainly one way to put it. Eloquent too, but Shunsui Kiraka could find no humor in the situation while watching Urutsunime Ya swear in disbelief. The rest of the royal guard in the Siriti were no better, their expression stuck in varying degrees of outplayed. Then again, Shunsui knew that his expression was no better. His face was pulled taut due to the simmering emotions threatening to spill out from within him, and he was doing very little to suppress them. Beyond the grief, and beyond the disbelief, there was only anger. Waiwak had gotten away and blew up any chance they had of pursuit by dealing a critical blow to the Shiba clan's firework cannon. Waiwak had gotten away even after what he'd done. For a second, a trace of irrational venom flickered over Shunsui's eyes, as he gazed at the so-called royal guard. If all of them were so strong, then why had they not been able to defend the old man at his most vulnerable state after his Bankai was stolen? Of course, Waiwaka's own strength and capabilities weren't lost to him, but more often than not, the death of a loved one caused irrational sentiment. His grip tightened around the hilt of his trusted blades, veins bulging beneath the skin of his forearms. He was angry, angrier than he'd ever been before, yet he had nowhere to direct it. All he had now was frustration, and a scowl no one would ever associate with him. Calm down. Fury besets the mind. Remember what the old man taught. Shunsui felt the soft hands of his Zanpakuto spirit reach out to him in consolation, their condolences and insistence to calm him, bidding him to ease his burdens, but he didn't need that right now. It would be so simple to seek comfort or dwell over his grief, yet he couldn't do that. He wasn't the only one hurting, and he had his duty, not only as a Shinigami but as the most qualified captain after the old man, to take the role of head commander. As a student of Genri Yusai, he couldn't waver. He was sure that wherever Yucatec was on the battlefield, his friend and fellow student would be doing the same. Then suddenly all the anger and grief were gone, bottled up and replaced by a forced calm that didn't quite make the cut. He couldn't bring himself to smile, nor assuage the growing atmosphere of dread permeating through the air even after the Quincy had called for their retreat. In truth, he wanted nothing more than to scream in frustration and self-reproach for what had happened. He was the old man's student. Sure, he'd been preoccupied fighting off his own adversary, but it hadn't been to the point where his opponent was too skilled. Instead, he'd limited his own capabilities to match just a little bit over his adversaries. It was done in order to stall and get a read on the enemy forces. Intel. He who knows the enemy, wins the war. His choice was one he was now severely regretting. He'd always had full faith in the old man and had never bothered thinking that the old man would ever need any help. He was the immovable mountain, the unbreakable pillar supporting the unit that was court guard squads, and now he was nothing but another casualty listed on a bloody report. Damn it, he didn't want to do this right now. He wanted to find a bar, plop himself down over a seat, then drink away his own sanity. He could have helped. He could have helped. His eyelids pursed shut, a shudder traveling down his back. His Bankai was dangerous, and he wasn't sure if the enemy could have stolen it from him, but at the very least, if he'd attacked all out from the beginning, he could have interfered in the confrontation with Yamamoto. He didn't. Now Yamamoto was dead. Dead. Deader than dead surely. Shunsui ignored the frantic actions of the members of the Royal Guard trying to make an attempt to chase after Waiwak. They'd failed their duty, and he had failed his. The negativity was shared all around, made worse because he was making no effort to cheer himself up. With the Siriti in ruins, Captain killed, and collateral damage to the Rokanga, everything was a mess that had to be dealt with. He considered shirking off his responsibilities, but the old man would have had his head for the action. There were simply no excuses for a dereliction of duty, emotionally impaired or not. Yamamoto's defeat struck hard, more so for him as he grew up under the old man's tutelage, yet this was why he had to keep moving on. Gather the dead. The Siriti had been attacked, but it has not yet fallen. Honor the sacrifice of the dead, and one day soon, we will avenge them all. He yelled out, stone-faced and bitter, yet concealing it behind the faked joviality he was known for. Perhaps only his lieutenant or Yucatec would be able to notice the difference of how he ordinarily acted and now, but he needed to convey a sense of confidence to the defeated even if he didn't feel all that happy himself. He alternated between emotions of resignation and resolution before pulling out a clay jar of alcohol and downing the burning drink in one go. He'd need it before doing what was needed. Naneo, he greeted as he felt the spiritual energy of his lieutenant appear near him. He'd ordered her to stay away from the fighting and focus on aiding the injured to the 4th Squad's barracks. Her clothing was ruffled and smeared with patches of dried blood, but it wasn't her blood, so it was fine. Parts of the blood smeared corners of the rimless glasses she wore, which was odd because knowing her, she would have cleaned them by now. A loss in visibility in a fight was detrimental. You know what else was odd? She wasn't berating him with an endless slur of abuse as he shattered the clay jar of alcohol he had in his hand, and then promptly downed another. Instead, she walked up to him as he pulled out a third jar, swiped in from his hand, and then downed the entire thing herself, her cheeks flaring red from the alcohol's potency. Didn't take you for a drinker. Finally breaking out of your shell, ISE-. Captain. With all due respect, I can handle it from here. Naneo unpinned her secretary-like black hair and used the pin to secure a bandage over her left arm. She must have gotten injured sometime during the fight with the Quincy, Shunsui idly observed, but he didn't say anything and allowed her to get her point across. You've already given the orders to gather the dead as protocol dictates. All that's left is to ascertain damage and look for survivors, something that doesn't really require a captain's participation. The head captain, I was there when Captain Anohana left to try and save him only after the enemy had left. She's still yet to return. Maybe the commander. Shunsui used a hand to pull down his straw hat over his face. He knew what Naneo was insinuating, and it was if a ray of light was shining in the dark. Worse, he found himself nodding at Naneo's offer before flash-stepping towards where he'd last seen Yamamoto's body fall. It was an errant decision not made with logic as a fallacy, yet he could be forgiven in the fact that he shared a certain non-blood but familial relationship with the head commander. Besides, So iPhone, ever a stickler to the rules, was already using her squad's men to sweep over the Siraidi's remains in a far more effective manner than ordinary Shinigami. With her still alive, the task could be settled even without him, though she'd certainly glare at him for not helping. As far as he knew, Kanpeke, Kukaki, and Saijin were critically injured and were thus unable to contribute. Shunsui could offer aid, but here he was speeding towards Yamamoto. A distance away from him, Shunsui spotted the figure of Jushiro Yukitake approaching as well, but his friend was stopped when So iPhone appeared and gave him a piece of her mind. Still, the fact that Yukitake had seen him and nodded towards him, meant that his friend was trusting him to verify their teacher's condition. Shunsui wouldn't allow himself to disappoint, and with another burst of spiritual energy, he directly flash-stepped to where he sensed Anohana's unique spiritual signature. She was hunched over the ground, and surrounded by pieces of rubble from broken walls and shattered tiles. Her complexion was pale, making her seem far frilier than any time he'd ever seen her before. "Captain Anohana," he called out softly, trying not to distract her with his greeting. Anohana didn't answer, her mouth set into a line and expression clipped. Sweat trickled down her forehead, which crinkled as her Lieutenant Isane tentatively wiped the perspiration away before once more standing respectfully to the side. It was only then that Shunsui got a good look at what Anohana was working with. There was blood everywhere, dripping over stone, and smearing into white granite. Yamamoto had been bifurcated across the chest. The strike had cut in from Yamamoto's right elbow and bisected through the rest of Yamamoto's body from just above the waist. He'd managed to keep his left arm intact by virtue of it being held in a guarded position when Waiwak had attacked, but he'd lost his right forearm, his lower body, and any trace of the overwhelming spiritual energy Shunsui had long since grown accustomed to Yamamoto possessing. Shunsui couldn't feel anything from the old man. No one could. Yamamoto Genryusai was dead in all sense of the word, but the sheer concentration on Anohana's face had him holding his breath in a terse silence. A layer of blue healing Kido was spread around Yamamoto's remains and covered him completely in a translucent dome. When Shunsui looked closely, he could see the smallest up and down motion over Yamamoto's chest, and a wave of tentative relief washed over him. He wanted to laugh in joy, but feared the noise may interrupt Anohana. He left Anohana alone to do her thing, and instead inched towards Isane, who must have been watching Anohana from the beginning. The small easygoing grin over his face wasn't as forced as it used to be. "How is he?" He asked for specifics. However, he wasn't going to like what he was going to hear. "He's going to die," Isane delivered the news, which shook Shunsui's being, the grin fading from his face. "Captain Anohana has only been managing to keep his vitals alive, but that's it. He doesn't have the spiritual energy left to sustain himself, and any he manages to gather can't be retained in his body. He doesn't have long unless..." "Unless what?" Shunsui remarked sharply, the sound almost like a wounded growl. "Oriaminu. Her power defies the basis of healing Kido." If it's her, she might be able to help," Isane supplied hastily. Then what were they waiting for? Didn't that mean the old man was going to truly die when Anohana's spiritual reserves depleted? The thought was jarring, and more than a little disconcerting, but rather than aid Yamamoto, Shunsui couldn't help but notice that the Zero Squad was putting more emphasis on devising a way back to the Soul King's palace. Resentment was the first thing he felt, as he decided to abandon Shinigami protocol and request the help of a human. It was better than letting the old man die while the others did nothing. They stared down at Yamamoto's form in regret, but they still didn't even bother to offer any sort of assistance. His lips twisted into a tight scowl, his brows narrowing fiercely. Fury came after resentment that they were putting the old man's life second to whatever objective they had, but then came comprehension. It hadn't been more than 40 or 50 minutes and the entire Soul Society was changing. More accuracy, the entire place was collapsing. Shunsui stumbled on his feet as his footing destabilized from the fractures that formed beneath him and everywhere the eye could see. Great slabs of tiled earth rose and upturned the surroundings into a wasteland of dirt and dust. Up in the sky, gargantua-like fissures tore into the space, prying open and revealing a black void. "No. This can't be." Shunsui turned just in time to see Ichibe of the royal guard arriving through a Senkaimon guided by a hell butterfly. The other members of the royal guard noticed him just as quickly and flocked to him. In any case, Shunsui's attention lingered not on Ichibe, but the Senkaimon to the human world Ichibe had opened. There was his ticket to request Orium's assistance in time, and he didn't hesitate to move forward. Even if something was happening with the Soul Society, Jushiro was still around and could lead just as well as him anyway. In the blink of an eye, Shunsui appeared in front of the Senkaimon, a foot lifted in order to step through. However, a large hand stopped him in his tracks. "Best not to go in there," Ichibe warned grimly, voice gruff and hollow. "It's dangerous and it won't last. Look around you and you'll understand." The ground shattered from beneath Shunsui's feet again, the spiritual energy comprising the Soul Society's stability shifting and breaking to reveal patches of the Danga. The bridge between dimensions was blurring. No longer could a path be seen, but rather, the path was shortening until it was infinitesimally small. Had he been in there during the process, he would have surely died. The knowledge was jarring, prompting him to give a stiff nod to Ichibe. When Shunsui looked down beneath him, he no longer saw the dark patches of the Danga, he saw the skies of the human world. He blinked at the sheer convenience of it all, but one glance at Ichibe and he understood that the sight was probably the worst kind of bad. Ichibe clearly knew what was going on. "The worlds are merging," Ichibe said reluctantly, a large hand placing itself beneath his chin. Waiwak has begun the process of blurring the lines between the living and the dead. He is breaking the balance set about by the ancestors of the Siridi's noble clans by assimilating the worlds together. Should we allow Waiwak to continue, everything that has been worked for during the past thousands of years will be for naught. This will be the greatest blight in the Soul Society's history, and it would seem as if Waiwak had struck here first. Ichibe's veins bulged over his skin when he noticed the ruins of the Shiba clan's cannon. The other members of the Zero Squad bowed their heads in their failure. It's too late. He's already begun the process. For now we must retreat and find an alternative means to access the Soul King's palace, defeat Waiwak, and then reinstate the world balance. Much of what Ichibe had said might have meant something to Shunsui, but right now, all he cared about was the strain he could see on Anohana's face. She wouldn't be able to last much longer. Time was of the essence, and explanations can come later. When Soifone, Yukatake, Mayuri, and the other captain arrived, both inured and not, the bickering and shouting began after seeing Yamamoto's condition. This shouldn't have happened. What were you fools doing after I sent the signal that there was danger in the Siridi? Soifone wasn't mincing words. Her squad had been the first to report sightings of white-clad individuals in the Soul Society, but no one had been able to react on time. She herself was just as guilty, but the stress and outrage were clouding her judgment. The other surviving captain bristled while holding onto the bodies of their injured fellow captains. Toshiro looked like he had words to say to Soifone, but he'd never get the chance to turn this into an argument. Yamamoto couldn't afford the time. "Quiet. All of you." Shunsui thumped his sword against the ground, the distinct clang sharply propagating outwards. "The old man would be ashamed of your behavior. We need order, stability. I've been told that if we can find Orium there's a chance to save the old man, so shut up and get yourselves in order. The realm's already falling apart and none of us know how long it will last." 10 more minutes, Ichibe supplied the answer. "Hakaifun, you and the others help gather as many injured Shinigami as you can. When the realm destabilizes, we'll all be ejected into the human world. We can't stay here even if we want to." They had no choice. The human world and the Soul Society were merging. Shunsui looked up at the strange star-shaped structure at the highest level of the Soul Society that was breaking apart the balance between the worlds. He could tell that Ichibe and the others would like nothing less than to storm their way up there, but there was currently nothing that could be done. A tactical retreat was the only answer at the moment. The Shinigami Kisokura Hara has a base of operations. Ichibe moved to take command. No one moved to oppose him. "I detest that man," Mayuri grumbled at the proclamation, but much like the others present, he still followed through with the suggestion. "I can respect his intellect, if nothing else." "I'll meet you all there," Shunsui said curtly. Ichibe was planning to wait the full 10 minutes to gather as many wounded as possible, but Yamamoto may not have that long to wait. Ichibe looked at Yamamoto's condition, and implicitly agreed with Shunsui's words. In a step, Shunsui flashed over towards Karakura town's sky. Due to the blurring of the boundaries between worlds, the spiritually aware were met with the odd sight of the Siridei floating amidst the sky. For Shunsui, it meant he didn't have to travel via Danga. In a city of millions, he had to locate Orium. It was a task that was far simpler to do than any could think about. He knew what Orium and the other Ryoka's spiritual energy felt like, and perhaps the most obvious of all, was that anyone spiritually aware was standing frozen in place. The sight of the Siridei crumbling in the sky would have shocked anyone, especially a certain group moving in large numbers. A group of familiar humans were staring up at him as he made his way over. Shunsui recognized them as the Ryoka who'd infiltrated the Siridei to help rescue Rukia Kukaki. However, there were several new additions that even he wasn't quite familiar with. All of them were wearing Karakura High School uniforms with Orium leading everyone from the front. Tatsuki, Kigo, Chizuru, please just trust us, Orium pleaded. We need to get to Mr. Urahara's place. He'll know what's going on. Indeed. This isn't the time for questions. Someone's coming. Ishida glanced up at Shunsui's approach. Shunsui tipped his straw hat in greeting, but couldn't afford idleness. Rather than speak right away, he strode directly beside Orium. Sorry, but I need your assistance. He abruptly and carefully picked her up, prompting her to yelp. Let her go, you sleazy bastard. At any other time, he would have been amused to have a human kick him in the face, but this wasn't that time. He didn't flinch, nor did he even feel the attack. Instead, in his frustration at all the distraction, he unconsciously leaked a bit of his spiritual pressure. His assailant, a tomboy of a girl, was immediately panting for breath and straining to stay on her feet. It was as if someone had just punched her in the gut, a choked gasp escaping her throat. Tatsuki, stop. He's not a bad guy, Orium tried to reason before directing her attention on Shunsui. Can you tell me what's going on? Yamajiji's going to die if I don't hurry. Shunsui said curtly while doing his best to reel back in his spiritual pressure. Tatsuki, Kigo, and Chizuru, who were the most affected, visibly sighed in relief. Also, the world's going to shit right now, so I suggest making your way to Urahara's like you were doing. The faster the better. Peace said. Shunsui glanced up to the Siridei crumbling in the human world's sky and watched Ichibe already leading the other Shinigami to Kisuke's. This made things easier. They'd probably taken Yamamoto with them, which everyone could just gather at Kisuke's shop. This in mind, Shunsui made to bolt. Wait, Orium called out, not to Shunsui, but to Sato and Ishida. If something dangerous is happening in town, we have to get Yuzo. Yuzo? That was a name Shunsui wasn't quite familiar with, but it wasn't difficult to see that she must have been a person of importance with how both Sato and Ishida tensed. Sato, take everyone and go. I'll go and get Yuzo, then meet the rest of you there. Ishida pushed up his glasses and disappeared in the direction of the Kurosaka clinic. This won't take long. With her piece said, Orium beckoned Shunsui to move as fast as he liked, and fast he did. A few blinks, blurred images, and flashes later, and the both of them arrived in front of Kisuke's shop. Already, the Shinigami led by Ichibe were helping set down wounded, while Kisuke appeared to take stock of the situation with his Hine and the Shiba siblings. What happened? Orium asked, a tremor in her tone. No time. Shunsui didn't bother answering and instead, carefully led her to where he saw Anohana nearly collapsing in exhaustion. She'd been keeping Yamamoto's vitals alive even while the Soul Society melded with the human world. Help him. Please, Shunsui's voice was fragile, terse. In response, Orium gave a quick nod, and deployed an orange barrier that enveloped what was left of Yamamoto's form. In the meantime, Shunsui began pacing, trying to distract himself from looking at the pained grimace on Orium's face. Surely the old man wasn't going to die? No. No, he wouldn't think about it, and just let her work. The intensity of his presence may negatively affect her, so it was with reluctance that he left her alone and joined the bickering of his fellow captains. All of the captain were being critical of each other's failure, and it was getting them nowhere. Shunsui had half the mind to put an end to all the shouting, but in its own way, he could use the distraction. Ichibei had gathered the members of the royal guard together and all were discussing in hushed tones when the improbable happened. Lightning writhed in the sky, tendrils forking upwards and over the outline of a rounded border. Under Waiwaka's power, the process of world assimilation had begun. This meant that the Soul Society, the human world, and Hueco Mundo were being forcibly merged into one. The process had already happened for the Soul Society and the human world, which meant there was only one place remaining. Hueco Mundo. Impossibly, it was fighting back against Waiwaka's influence, a sight no one missed. How could they when gigantic swords manifested around the outer border of what could only have had been Hueco Mundo itself? Every weapon was primed and aimed towards the star-shaped formation high up above where Waiwaka resided, and then Armageddon began. The unrelenting sound of screeching steel echoed in the air as the spiritual projections rocketed forth and battered against the 72 barriers of the Soul King's palace. It was a sight the spiritually unaware couldn't see, and yet, it produced natural phenomena. Winds raged, fires bursting forth from out of nowhere. Gales hammered over the city, shattering glass, and causing panic in the street as wires snapped from telegraph poles. The barriers around the star-shaped structure warped and bent, before black shadow-like creatures returned fire with neither side backing down, and then utter silence abruptly settled in. Both sides just stopped at once as if accepting a small reprieve, and a reprieve it was. The entire exchange had been a test, a warm-up. All at once, the swords around Hueco Mundo vanished to be replaced by something that felt much more lethal. A layer of flame pulsed, two new types of swords beyond the size of human imagination manifesting. One to cleave the mountains, another to bring about the fires of damnation. Quantity had been replaced with quantity, yet neither sword moved to attack. Should they be unleashed, not only would the Soul King's palace be affected, but the people in the human world too. A ceasefire? Shunsui let go of the breath he'd been subconsciously holding, and much like the others, felt dread creeping into them. Just what sort of monsters were they facing here? Even so, iPhone's mask of confidence had shattered to reveal a look of helplessness that not even Yoriyuki's presence could assuage. He shivered, hands pulling on his pink hirei to wrap tighter around himself. As for Ichibei and the other members of the royal guard, they looked intrigued and unreadable at best. How are we supposed to compete against that? He didn't know who said it in the crowd of Shinigami, but what everyone did know was that it shattered any semblance of morale anyone could muster. He himself was lacking any sure answer to deal with the situation. We will need allies, Kisuke's cryptic voice pierced through the somber silence. The first to understand what Kisuke had just suggested wasn't anyone from the Seirai or the human world, instead, it was Jin Ichimaru, who was bound in several layers of Kido spells and held in Tessai's grip. Jin Ichimaru the traitor? Shunsui had to blink to see if he was seeing right, but no amount of rubbing his eyes was making Jin vanish. Therefore, this wasn't his imagination fucking with him then. The other people who recognized Jin were mute before calls to execute the traitor were being made, much to the discomfort of Ranjika, who hovered by Jin and looked ready to snap at anyone who approached with ill intentions. Fortunately, Shinji Hirako and his group of vizards spoke up from where they were already resting in Kisuke's shop. What allies do you speak of, Kisuke? We have none left. There's practically nothing left of the previous balance in the world either. The only new addition of fighting power we have are any new humans who can see us. Do elaborate about allies, sly friend. The smile on Shinji's face wasn't quite reaching his eyes. If the man's intelligence was anything to go by, like Jin, he'd probably guessed who Kisuke was referring to and didn't like it one bit. Shinji looked appalled, daring Kisuke with narrowed eyes to even suggest bringing the topic up at all. Drop it. Shunsui could read between the lines and the silent messages between Kisuke and Shinji. He himself was admittedly curious to what one as vaunted for his intelligence as Kisuke would suggest for an ally to rely on. Aizen and the Vasto of White were who Kisuke suggested after what they'd just witnessed. Jin was laughing. No one else was. Chapter 58. For the past few moments since rousing back into awareness, Jin felt like everything he ever considered common sense was entirely turned over on its head. Granted, He was running a tad light-headed from his injuries and the extensive amount of keto that restrained him. He could hardly lift a finger nor channel his spiritual energy in a way that would allow him to escape, not that he presently had any such motivations however. Ranjika wasn't being vocal about it, but she was certainly fretting over him, the only plus to this already hectic situation, and perhaps the only thing he really cared about. She was standing on pins and needles around him, but not because of anything he was doing, but because of the number of hostilities around him. She was practically glued to him, her eyes darting left and right, and her hands constantly on the pommel of her sword despite still recovering from her injuries. Neither of them knew when an accidental blade could just up and stab him, right? He smiled a fox-like grin and openly laughed at Kisuk's suggestion, uncaring about how it infuriated many of the Shinigami present who resented him for his betrayal. He was acting like a bastard, but who was he to deny his own amusement? Other than those that he actually viewed favorably, he could care less about anyone else. This was just his personality, and the reason for the tenacity and bullheadedness he'd displayed in his pursuit of revenge against Aizen. Snakes were solitary creatures lurking in the dark. They were opportunists who bide their time in order to strike a single lethal blow, sinking their poisoned fangs into unsuspecting prey. Be it animal, or megalomaniacs convinced in their road to godhood, Shinso would never fail to reach. One doesn't provoke a snake and expect no form of retaliation. There weren't many things that could provoke Jin into action. His poise was almost impeccable behind a carefully placed smile, but once again, snakes are solitary creatures. Once they find their companion, they entwine themselves even if just for a moment. The thing was, Jin had never let go of the warmth he'd felt and cherished above all. Every Shinigami needs a reason to fight, a purpose, and his had always been Ranjiku. Call him stubborn or ignorant of what Ranjiku felt in his pursuit of revenge against Aizen, but one thing will always remain true. Not once had Jin Ichimaru ever betrayed himself and his goals. You can leer at him, detest him, or curse him, but he'd always remained true on his path. Therefore, it didn't matter if those in the crowd around him glared at him. All that mattered was that he'd finally realized what mattered to him more than revenge. Back off. All of you. Ranjiku growled in agitation, her spiritual energy was fluctuating around her, lifting her bangs up over her temples and accentuating her narrowed eyes. Injured as she may be, there were things more important to her than her own well-being. Just like Jin, every Shinigami needed a reason to fight, whether it be for justice, ideals, or selfish reasons, it was all the same. Ranjiku's position as a seated officer and lieutenant of Squad 10 deterred many of the lower-ranked Shinigami, but her fellow lieutenants still alive from the Quincy invasion stared at her in confusion. Izuru Kira of Squad 3 was the one most affected by the scene in front of him, Renji and the others, less so. All Renji was seeing was red. His captain had died and even had his Bankai stolen. Worse, Rukia had fallen mute at the news and was still in a state of shock, entirely unreceptive to her environment. Anger was the deepest emotion all Shinigami were feeling, and Jin noticed that he was the convenient scapegoat to vent. Ranjiku was of similar wavelength to Jin and tightened her defenses around him even if she had no confidence in opposing a captain. Her own captain didn't seem inclined to help her either, injured as he was and blinded by his rage against Jin in the ploy to harm Hinamori. Of course, the opinions of the lieutenants were one thing, but the captains and wizards were another. "You're in quite a bind, Ichimaru," Shinji drawled, a small smile playing at his lips. "At least something went right in this shit show, but tell me, I didn't think you'd be in any mood for laughter." Jin snorted derisively, his eyes squinting at the murderous glares around him and taking note of any who may attack Ranjiku in order to get to him. If nothing changed any time soon, his hit list would only continue to grow until he may as well side with Aizen in order to kill everyone. Speaking of which, he had a specific retort for the smiling blonde bullhead bastard. "And I didn't think any of ya would have suggested working with Aizen? How are the masks? With how you've taken to em, you'd think that Aizen did ya all a favor." The grin left Shinji's face to be replaced by a grim countenance, much like the other unreceptive captains, but the members of the wizards were different. Ranjiku suddenly staggered, blood spurting from her wounds and splattering across Jin's face as she blocked a strike intended for him. "Hiri!" Shinji yelled with a grunt, stepping forward and grabbing onto a little brat's sleeve. said Brat in pink sweatpants and matching jacket, violently shook out of Shinji's grip and advanced. Meanwhile, Jin's eyes had fully opened, revealing the sharp blue of his pupils. That one was going to die. Fuck this bastard. Hiyori shoved Rangiku to the ground when she refused to move and clamped a hand over Jin's temples. I'll just kill the traitor here. She squeezed harder and harder, but Jin didn't so much as flinch before a cane smacked down over Hiyori's head. Now that's enough. There must be a reason as to why he's here, yes? From what Lieutenant Matsumoto tells me, the only reason Jin is here is because he aided her and indirectly, all of you, in the attack by the Quincy. Everyone was taken aback by the admission, even Hiyori, who let go of Jin in her stupor, allowing Rangiku to squeeze in between them and glare at everyone who'd made no move to help. Only Orium looked troubled, but she was too occupied with healing the injured. Obviously it's a lie. So iPhone pushed through the crowd and glowered. My squad has reported sightings of a different figure in the battle. Rangiku bit down on her lower lip and balled her hands into fists. He was there. If not for him, I would have died. Stop judging and let him explain. She looked pleadingly at Jin, who gradually wilted under the weight of her stare. Jin, if you're really sorry, then enough lies. Tell us what's really going on. Jin's mouth twitched, the edges of his lips curving downward as he considered Rangiku's proposition. He was captured and held at sword point. He could be killed at any moment due to his branding as a traitor. At this point, he honestly had nothing else left to lose aside from the faith Rangiku had in him, and that was something he wouldn't give up. So, he began to explain everything from the beginning, ignoring how he was basically turning his back on years of effort to foster trust with Aizen in order to kill him. It all started with a gift of persimmons, and a desire to retrieve what was lost. To Jin, everything made sense in his story, his personal reasoning and logic flawless, but Rangiku had begun shaking her head and sniffling by the time he detailed how no sacrifice was too much. Jin, you idiot. Rangiku knew that her Jin was never a bad person, but to hear that he'd sacrificed his reputation and future to get back at Aizen on her behalf was heartbreaking. While Rangiku and Izura looked as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders, many weren't so forgiving. Admitting your motive doesn't absolve you of your crimes, Ichimaru, Toshiro said neutrally from where Anohana was healing his injuries. He earned a genuine glare from Rangiku, which he reluctantly ignored. You aided in Aizen's machinations and harmed others as a result. Toshiro's words were sharp, and not even Shunsui or Jushiro could speak otherwise despite their tendency to forgive if possible. Jin's only response was a snort. Was I a skin for any of your forgiveness? Jin, Rangiku hissed into Jin's ear while wiping her tears away with the back of her hands. Stop. Stop provoking them, right. Jin supposed there was no merit in doing so anyway aside from personal entertainment. Besides, someone else came to temporarily draw the attention away from him anyway. Urayu Ishida had arrived with not only Yuzo, but an unconscious Ichigo as well, much to the shock of everyone including Ishida, who still looked like he couldn't believe what he'd found. Jin hummed in curiosity. Ah yes, the Kurosaka boy. Aizen had had a strange fixation on the orange-haired Shiba descendant, and evidently, there was reason for it. From a substitute Shinigami, the Kurosaka boy had become something similar to a Vasto lord with the last display in the fake Karakura town. His skin was a pale gray, and his orange hair was now waist-length. Over his form were tattered remnants of a Shinigami's Shiakusho, and at the center of his chest was a large hollow hole. Horns jutted from the boy's head, but different from before, his masked visage was absent. Jin began to think. Perhaps the Kurosaka boy was like the Vizards and had an on and off stage? Regardless, the mechanics must have been the same, and the boy would need to resummon his mask if he wished to display his previous level of power. As it was, the Kurosaka boy was harmlessly asleep. We should kill him before he proves a danger. No one knew who said it, nor did anyone care. What mattered was the logic behind it. Instantly, swords were drawn and lines were created amidst the disaster of the worlds fusing. Jin watched in interest as Karen, Orium, Ishine, Ishida, Chad, Sato, Yoriyuki, Kisuke, and the Vizards stood to defend Ichigo. Tatsuki and the others moved to shield their friend despite having no idea what was going on as well. Despite Orium healing Yamamoto, the head captain was still in an unconscious state, leaving Shunsui to act as a proxy while the royal guard watched on silently. Now, everyone should calm down a bit. Shunsui clapped his hands and gestured for everyone to sheath their swords. Reluctantly, they did. Shunsui turned to address his fellow captain and Shinigami. I'm sure many of you believe it prudent to kill the boy now, but try to recall Kisuk's suggestion of cooperating with not Aizen, but the Vasto of White. I'm sure that killing the boy would not endear any in Hueco Mundo to us, am I right, Ichimaru? Jin simply nodded. The boys made friends with a few Arrancar in high places. If you really intend to come to an agreement with the Vasto of White and by proxy, Aizen, then you really shouldn't be quick to murder. Of course, that includes me. Awfully convenient, Toshiro said snidely. But not wrong either. Shunsui wished he could just sit down and drink his growing stress away in the growing animosity, but he couldn't. Not know when Yamamoto couldn't take the reins. The Soul Society had lost consecutively ever since the fake Karakura town battle, and emotions were now running high with the number of causalities and injured. Honestly, Shunsui knew he likely wouldn't be faring as well if Orium hadn't been able to keep the old man from dying. Small miracles, and since Orium was defending Ichigo, Shunsui would do his best to repay a favor. Out of everyone here, Jin knows the Vasto of White and Aizen best, making it unwise to ignore his words. We should at least take them with a grain of salt. Shunsui shifted his attention to Ishida, who was still carrying an unconscious Ichigo who Yuza was fretting over with Karen and his hind. Let it be said that everyone in Ichigo's group noticed that Yuza could now see Ichigo, but no one was simply bringing it up in the hostile environment. Now then, if you'd explain just how this all happened, then perhaps we can plan from there. Shunsui offered an olive branch. Well, I found him in his room. Ishida pushed up his glasses. Years of studying under his father had made him accustomed to pressure. He spoke calmly. He was just laying there unconscious with Ms. Kurosaki here staring at him. All eyes turned to Yuzu, who expectedly flinched under all the attention. She was trembling, and if not for his hind and Karen helping to support her, she may have dropped to her knees from the spiritual pressure around her. Mom brought him, Yuzu explained tentatively, shocking both his hind and Karen into silence. Ah yes, Masaka did drop by. Kisuk seemed to have a light bulb moment that caused his hind no small amount of frustration. Sorry, did I not mention it before? It slipped my mind, and well, it was her description of the Vasto of White that made me proposition a hypothetical alliance. As for the matter with Ichigo, let's all agree to put it aside for now. It isn't as important as that. Kisuk pointed up at the flower-like structure of the Soul King's realm and the swords surrounding Hueco Mundo. Jin perked up. Yes, straight to the matter at hand at last. Would they or would they not request assistance from a hated enemy to deal with another hated enemy? Well, the answer to this question was simple. It would seem that there's no choice to be had in this matter. An army of featureless black creatures with multiple eyes were released from the Soul King's palace, rushing straight towards those with spiritual awareness in the human world. Hueco Mundo offered nothing in response as a majority of the black specters rushed towards the spiritual signatures of the Shinigami. As much as Kisuk prided himself in his architectural design, he knew that his shop's defenses would hardly last. Hurriedly tapping his cane on the ground, Kisuk shattered the pavement beneath him to reveal his underground training facility, which everyone fell into. There right before everyone was a portal already opened to Hueco Mundo, made for a different purpose, but now serving another. Into the Garganta. Kisuk, Yoriyuki, and the Royal Guard wasted no time, but the same couldn't be said for everyone else. However, there really was no choice. The realm of the Soul Society was lost, and the human world had no real defenses to offer. Hueco Mundo was the only choice. Under Shunsui's lead, the Shinigami gathered the injured and began cautiously funneling into the Garganta with bated breath. For many, it was a simple gesture. Hope and pray. Hueco Mundo was his inner world. Shiro would be notified of anything that affects it or resides within it, and this situation was no different. He stood staring at the abrupt Garganta that dared open itself in the middle of his lands. It had been open for the past half hour, but he'd yet to deal with it simply because he'd been focusing his efforts on stopping Waiwak from gaining any ground against Hueco Mundo. Then again, The natural inclination of his reality marble to reject the world and govern a space as its own was proving resistant to whatever Waiwak was doing. Hueco Mundo would remain safe for the time being. It was with this realization that he was now shifting his focus onto the matter directly in front of him. The Garganta was fluctuating in energy, obvious signs that beings were in the midst of crossing through it. It would be their folly if they proved to be an enemy. The strength of a soul stemmed from their spiritual energy, and Hueco Mundo was his own soul laid bare. It wasn't an understatement to say that he was a god in this world, for everything as far as the eye can see was his inner reality. Putting aside his reservations about the fact that it had become a common occurrence to rip holes into his inner world, Gargantes, he readied himself for whatever trouble may come to him. Haribel, Nell, Grimjo, Coyote, Baragan, Eisen, and the other Arankar all began flocking to his location, all of them gathering at the first sign of trouble within Hueco Mundo. Though, he figured Eisen had just come for entertainment. Whatever it was that had happened outside Hueco Mundo, it would seem that Eisen understood and guessed who it was passing through the Garganta. Not that Shiro was ignorant, but he too knew just who it was that was coming and moved to the front. He knew how fast things were going to escalate when the forms of the Royal Guard appeared first with Kisuk and Yoryuki nearby. Everyone tensed at the presence of Shinigami entering Hueco Mundo. Of course, many also grinned with bloodlust and intent for battle. It was all in a hollow's nature, but the fact that Kaname-Tissen looked just as eager was unexpected. Before anyone could rush forward, they glanced at him first. He shook his head, and simply waited as more and more Shinigami began arriving. Sorry boss, Jin was grinning from ear to ear when he was carried in over Tessai's shoulder. I got captured, yeah. Eisen made no comment, but a gleam of curiosity flickered over his eyes before they remained on Kisuk and Yoryuki. Shut up, Jin, Rangiku elbowed Jin's side, but winced a moment later when she saw blood seep out of Jin's bandages. Sorry. Silence ensued as the Shinigami began to take up more and more space. Shiro noted that over half of the space the Shinigami were occupying were filled with the injured. The fact that he couldn't sense the presence of the Soul Society anymore was quite telling of their circumstances, but so what even if they came for help? Neither the human world or the Soul Society had ever cared for the well-being of Hollows. Hueco Mundo was their only home and sanctuary. Shiro had always wanted to be a hero who upheld his ideals, but as he was now, he'd gained aspects of a Hollow. He was different from before. He was the Vasto of White. Shiro could not in good faith abandon the views and hostilities fostered between Hollows and Shinigami over the course of eons. Yes, it was true that his friends and fellow Hollows turned Arankar would heed his words, but it didn't mean that they would be content with the decision. He could see Coyote visibly seething at the sight of Yamamoto's frail and unconscious figure supported by Anoha Naretsu, and he knew that there was nothing that could be done to console her. Starkey was uncharacteristically awake and solemn, while Lilynet had frozen up entirely. The rest of the Arankar were just as hostile if not indifferent like he was. By the time an unconscious Ichigo appeared surrounded by his friends and family, Silent's eyes dilated much like Nell's and Lilynet's. "We mean no harm," Ichibe said in a boisterous voice. "I'm sure you are all well aware of the circumstances outside Hueco Mundo, so let's just get to the point. We propose a ceasefire between sides to combine forces against a greater enemy." A greater enemy? Tissen sounded heated, veins popping over his skin. As if the words of heinous vile dogs running with their tail between their legs can count for anything. Despite Tissen being a Shinigami, many Arankar present acknowledged what he'd just said, much to the distaste of the Royal Guard and Shinigami. Exactly. A greater enemy? Bullshit. Brands yelled, flapping his great wings and taking to hovering in the air. Our lord is clearly stronger. Hueco Mundo still stands whereas the Soul Society has fallen. Equals we are not. Well said, Haribel crossed her arms and glared with cold indifference. Shiro is strong. We are strong. What makes you think we'd need you, an enemy? Ichibe closed his mouth, seeing that anything he'd say would only be met with resistance. Besides, Grimjo, Noidara, and many Arankar were getting ready to launch an attack as soon as the order was given, and Shiro was making no move to stop them. His silence was his answer to Ichibe's proposition. The Shinigami weren't in a position to seek an alliance to begin with, but asylum instead. Right, Then we simply request aid, Kisuk spoke up and tipped his hat down in greeting. If you could provide a little shelter for the storm, we will certainly remember this debt. Ichibe and the other members of the royal guard stared at Kisuk before shaking their heads in disapproval, yet none moved to stop him. A plea for sanctuary then? It was a simple matter to accept since Shiro didn't harbor much in the way of prejudice towards Shinigami like his fellow Hollows, but he wouldn't make a decision on impulse. Shiro didn't need the Shinigami, and if not for his own beliefs, he would have long since attacked by now. However, he didn't not only because of his ideals, but because there were those that suddenly took their own initiatives when Grimjo and the rest nearly attacked. Silent stepped forward followed by Nelil Tuadolshwank, and even Araniro Arururi. Each of them garnered their own form of attention. Silent stood with her arms spread out in a protective gesture in front of her stunned family, while Nell shared glances with Haribal and the other Arankar. Araniro Arururi stood hesitantly near Jushiro Yukatake, and the remaining members of the Shiba clan who looked at him as if they were seeing a ghost. We will vouch for them, Nell said solemnly, glancing once at Ichigo, and then to Silent and Araniro. Haribal and the other Arankar looked betrayed at Nell's actions, but fell into contemplation a second later when Aizen suddenly spoke up. I see, the second release, Aizen said with a small grin. An Arankar's initial release is equivalent to a Shinigami's Shikai form and a Hollow's attainment of Shinigami powers. If so, the second release is considered the equivalent of Bankai and an even greater understanding of Shinigami abilities. By keeping the Shinigami around, you hope to glean insight. Am I correct, Ms. Adolshwank? Nell looked startled and hesitant, but she slowly nodded in acceptance of Aizen's words. It was a favor, plain as day. Better yet, it was a deduction that Baragan, Haribal, and the Espada were actually considering in pursuit of their second release. Nell and Silent looked at Aizen, and when they did, the meaning was clear despite Shiro agreeing to designate a spot for the Shinigami. You owe me. Thinking about it, the reasoning was simple. Even if Shiro could decide everything with a word, it would be done at the discontent of the other Arankar who would have seen no reason to keep Shinigami around. In this case, Aizen provided the premise for Shiro to do what he felt was right while simultaneously doing a favor for Nell and the others, and advancing his own agenda. A pro-gamer move. Well, that went better than expected. Yoryuaki eased the tension out of her muscles while surveying the Arankar keeping their distance at the foot of a large hill of white sand. Unlikely, Jin grunted. Putting the Quincy and their king aside, none of you know half of what Aizen is capable of. Every one of his actions has meaning. Shunsui and the other captains and wizards mulled over Jin's words, but a select few seemed to be too far into their own worlds to contribute. Saijin Komamura had been silent ever since Tassen's appearance, and was in no mood to offer any meaningful insight. At another part of the designated zone, the Kurosaka family reunion was being held in private with Nell, Silent, and Ichigo's friends. Even further away was Kyokaku Shiba demanding to see Kaien Shiba only to be held back vehemently by Ganju calling her crazy for making demands to the Arankar. You see, Kaien had left before anyone could even call out to him, hence Kyokaku's agitation. Of course, her calls to give the bastards hell were being met with deaf ears, but this was beside the point. Forget about the others for now, Kisuk waved dismissively, a small smile creeping up his face. We have more important matters to consider. Dibs on not being the one to explain to the head captain about why he'd be waking up in Hueco Mundo. Oh shit, the geezer's waking up. Shunsui didn't sound half as worried as he looked. The relief on his features supplanting all else, though Kisuk was going to have to put a damper on the mood. Actually, not quite, Kisuk grinned wryly while adjusting his hat over his head. I'm just calling dibs early, lest I find myself the butt of a difficult explanation. Mr. Abarai can attest to this as he was the one who broke the news to Kukaki that her brother was dead. The captains winced at the reminder of their losses to the Quincy shortly after the Battle of Karakura Town. The Quincy had taken an opportunity and struck while everyone was weakened. It was a tactical maneuver. No one escaped unscathed. Perhaps if the Royal Guard actually helped and didn't leave Yamajiji on his own, Shunsui shadowed his features with his straw hat, lest the others see the scowl on his face. It was too late though since Shinji and Vazards noticed, but they didn't bring it up. Speaking of the Royal Guard, they were off discussing matters on their own again. The name Waiwak and the Vasto of White were frequently heard out of context, but none dared interrupt. Each of them alone could rival or surpass Yamamoto in capabilities, and none of them were in a pleasant mood after the talks of cooperation had shifted to asylum. Just leave them alone for now, Jushiro mediated. What matters now is who's the one that's been charged to oversee us. If Ichimaru is correct about Aizen, then it's best we prepare. I am right, Jin said snidely before cheerily grinning. Now when do you all plan to release me? Rainjiku, they're ignoring me now, aren't they? Rainjiku sighed near Jin, but inwardly she was just happy that the Jin she knew was back. That was all that mattered. Jin hummed to himself. If I was Aizen, what purpose could I have in aiding an enemy? My, what a pleasant welcome for your new overseer, a voice stirred the hornet's nest. Aizen unceremoniously appeared in front of everyone who promptly drew their swords. And there's the catch, Jin drawled inwardly, his eyes narrowing into slits as iPhone Flash stepped to hold Aizen under a blade's edge. What tricks and treachery is this? iPhone demanded coldly. Her sword was held in reverse grip, and she'd locked Aizen's arms behind him. None were averse to her actions. Some like Yuri and Toshiro would have done far worse, but Aizen remained unfazed. Tricks. Aizen raised an elegant brow. Clearly you all overvalue yourselves. iPhone bristled, her grip tightening on her sword's hilt. Tell me, Aizen leaned his head closer towards the edge of iPhone's blade, his neck entirely exposed and unguarded. What makes you all think that I require such petty things to deal with any of you? Cocky last words, iPhone's eyes sharpened into a scornful glare. She had no qualms about adding more pressure to her sword's edge. Hardly. Aizen did nothing to remove the sword pressed up against his neck. If you believe you can kill me in your tenuous circumstances, then try. You'll rue the action. A shiver suddenly traveled down everyone's backs as a silent yet oppressive spiritual pressure continued to permeate through the area. Ah, you finally noticed her. Aizen shrugged while iPhone and the other captain stared at the lone figure overlooking them from a distant plateau. Coyote Gingerbuck waited with an endless patience. Dear Coyote should be quite familiar to many of you, and it's a fact that she hates your head commander. Her trust and devotion to the Vasto of White is the only thing keeping her back. She's watching and waiting for a reason to act. Coyote readied her gun while staring fixedly at their direction. Any reason? Aizen carefully gripped iPhone's sword with his index finger and thumb. iPhone grew flustered to admit that she was actually straining to hold her position. She growled and poured more spiritual energy into her arms. Silence stretched in the area, but Aizen didn't miss the way iPhone and several Shinigami glanced at Ichibe and the others who were now paying rapt attention at the threat Coyote posed. The Royal Guard? Do you really think they would be enough to hinder Coyote? Many Shinigami glanced at the members of the Royal Guard near them again, much to Aizen's amusement. He actually laughed before letting go of iPhone's sword and leaving it where it was. What is considered strength? He began in a low drawl. Strength isn't only about personal capability, but connections as well. Here Aizen gestured towards somewhere farther away from where Coyote stood and where Shiro was standing over a large hill of swords. Coyote is not only strong in capability, but in relations. Look at her face. Does it look like she fears them? No, of course not. Why would she when she fully believes that no harm will come to her? The same applies for all the Hollows and Arrancar and Hueco Mundo, all because of a single individual. The Vasto of White, their Lord of Hollows. Aizen pressed his neck to iPhone's sword, not even bothering to use his spiritual energy to shield his skin from the razor edge. Go ahead, Captain. Swing that sword and provide justification for conflict. You'll all die. Aizen mused. If he wasn't strong enough to defeat the Vasto of White, then none of these fools stood a chance at all. iPhone, I believe that's enough. iPhone grudgingly sheathed her blade at Kisuk's prompting. Aizen's mouth twitched upwards. Finally. A fellow intellectual that wasn't Jinichi Maru. Contrary to expectations, but Aizen wasn't above using others to achieve his goals. It just so happened that Waiwak had earned Aizen's ire for taking something that shouldn't belong to him, and Kisuk and the others had appeared in an opportune moment. The enemy of my enemy is my pawn. Chapter 59, Intermission. Shiro frowned. In this new world that he'd found himself in, not everything was as simple as black and white, and just because he had power didn't mean that he should dictate the lives of anyone, yet here he was now. He stood up. Across from him was the vast expanse of what remained of his inner world in a dormant state. Ash and fire had mixed into a desert of pale white. The grass and fields of swords left buried and desolate. The winds that blew were no more than the dying fumes of a furnace. Once upon a time, it was haven for the oppressed. Now, it was the last bastion of defense preventing the full integration of Waiwaka's new world order. The power of spiritual beings is based on their output of spiritual energy, the strongest of which could affect material objects. The common hollow had the means to interact with the human world, and Ajich's class and Vasto lords all but dominated any area with their spiritual energy. The Shinigami were the same down from seated officers, to vice-captains, then captains themselves. In which case, what did that make him on the established power scale? His hands balled into fists while his mind stirred at the constant pressure of forcing back Waiwaka's influence on the borders of his world. He was the only one capable of doing so. The very nature of his soul and inner world made him stand on a different realm from those who gauged power by their amount of spiritual energy. His spirit could not only interact with the world, but overwrite it completely with different laws and rules. In the words of Ichibe and the others whom he'd overheard from his current spot on a hill of swords, he was referred to and hypothesized as a natural phenomenon only seen once in this world's history. Ichibe referred to him as a potential second coming, the meaning of which was lost to him as none elaborated. His lips thinned, eyes pressing shut as he concentrated. He felt the need to keep a close eye on them, but even if this was his world, the task was impossible unless he devoted a majority of his effort. Think of it like radio static: the more of it you have on a certain frequency, the less audible the noise on the other end until you fine-tune the radio. If Hueco Mundo was the medium of transmission, then each individual person inhabiting his world produces their own static which he would have to sort through and consciously suppress in order to focus on only a single source. The fact that he'd already diverted a majority of his attention to gather intel on the Zero Squad revealed the underlying effect of the warning Aizen had given him in advance. Noble is one way to describe them for their feats of strength and revolutionary insights, but if everything you hear and see on the surface is all that matters, then I suppose that even I can be considered a saint by revealing the hypocrisy and flaws of the Central 46. A joke, take it as you will. It was the first time Shiro had noticed Aizen appear so serious. The man looked like he was competing against actual competition that had the means to rival or surpass him, granted their individual spiritual energies far surpassed Yamamoto's. Aizen was always one who preferred strategy over raw power, the only exception being against adversaries deemed too inferior to plot against. This was the fallacy of pride, something that for all of Aizen's meticulousness and careful analytical deductions, he'd yet to realize himself. Shiro digressed and opened his eyes to peer down at the group of 5 powerhouses on the side of the Shinigami. The point of the matter was that if Aizen was bidding his time against the Zero Squad, then there was reason for concern. We are partners, yes. Aizen had almost sounded hesitant, as if the words were foreign, but the question was rhetoric. Aizen's memory was flawless, meaning that the only reason he'd asked was out of something incomprehensible for a man like him. There had been no need for an answer, and all Shiro could remember doing was observing the way Aizen inwardly mulled over recent developments before something of a peaceful expression washed over his features when Shiro simply nodded. The world is a lonely place at the top, yes truly. But steps must be taken. Take this as you will, but there are worse goals than disrupting the world order by seeking change to rewrite its inherent flaws rather than feign ignorance. The problem will always exist, and I simply choose to find a solution, albeit through the animosity of those too entrenched in the system unwilling to make sacrifices. A question then. If you were a larva trapped in the shell of your own cocoon, is it not natural to tear it down and experience the world outside unshackled and free? Shiro wasn't a fool. He could understand what Aizen was hinting at as he'd experienced it for himself. This world, this cocoon, was erroneous. Hollows were constantly hunted, conflicts between rival factions spanned thousands of years, and the most damning of all, limits. Shinigami, hollows, and humans, they all have an unsurpassable plateau of power. Vasto Lord, Captain, Quincy. No matter how much one struggled, they would be confined to the boundaries of their existence, never able to affect the world as a whole for better or for worse. It was a preordained existence, balanced at the cost of prolonged injustice. How could Eisen ever accept such a reality? Instead, he'd walked his own path and surpassed the unseen plateau of power through combining the nature of souls. Arrancar were the definite proof of Eisen's research. Greater strength is found not in balance, but in assimilation. No matter their titles or deeds, never forget only a single fact: the Zero Squad is and will always be a failsafe of this world order, and we as the anomalies will always be their enemies. I for carrying the weight of revolution, and you due to the nature of your own existence. A piece of advice for a partner: in using a pawn, trust not in the pieces, but in what those pieces will do. Shiro rubbed his temples at the memory. I do not have pawns. I prefer direct methods, was his sole reply. And that is why we're partners, yes. The way Eisen had smirked was still in Shiro's mind. Of course, the fact that Kyuka Suijitsu was gushing at the sight of her two favorite people getting along proved that Eisen was in fact being genuine. After all, he'd never had that sort of reaction from Kyuka in all the other times he'd interacted with Eisen, and this was telling. Eisen could care less about those around him, but it was once again out of a vain pride born of superiority. The man had never truly considered meeting anyone near his level that wasn't an enemy to truly work with up until now, which was set in its own way. Sparing one last stare at the distant form of the royal guard, Shiro finally put his attention elsewhere. More specifically, to those idling near him. Starkey was half awake while sprawled on the ground, elbows up, and hands propped behind his head. His gaze was lidded, but not once did it ever leave the direction of the Shinigami making camp over their designated spot. He, just like Coyote and Lilynet, had no care about a second release as they already had it. Starkey's form denoted leisure, but those who knew him would be able to see the way he appeared ready to spring into action at any moment. Haribel, who stood with her arms crossed several feet away, was no different. Her hair swayed freely in the gentle breeze, the teal of her eyes narrowed in clear displeasure and grudging acceptance. If keeping Shinigami around had the chance to let her awaken her second release, then it was something that she could bear if Baragan had the patience to erect a throne of bone directly before the Shinigami and Royal Guard in order to observe them like lab rats. Of course, Baragan's actions unnerved many Shinigami, barring violence, there was nothing that could be done. Eisen described the situation of the Shinigami aptly. In Hueco Mundo, no hollow had any fear of danger. Further away from Baragan on a distant hill was Coyote polishing the silver revolver in her right hand. No matter how much she may have wanted to remain close to Shiro's side, old habits died hard. She'd always been the one protecting her fellow hollows and her Starkey from Shinigami. The fact that Yamamoto and equally strong Shinigami were present made it impossible for her to relax. Shiro could feel the tension permeating around him, but a majority of it was apprehension from the Shinigami. Of those presently near him like Starkey and Haribel, Nell was the only one who appeared to be thinking about something. Nell's gaze was distant, her lips pursed into a frown. Is this really necessary? Starkey stifled a yawn. This tentative peace was only going to last for so long. Haribel glanced sharply at Starkey before releasing a breath and shaking her head. If it's to our benefit, then there is purpose to the sacrifice Shiro is making by allowing them to stay. Benefit? From just watching them. Starkey turned on his side and leaned his right elbow on the ground to prop his chin on his hand. Why don't you ask the grumpy old bag of bones how well that's going? Haribel had no response. She could feel Baragan's irritation all the way from where she stood, everyone could. The haze of death surrounding Baragan wasn't exactly subtle. Rather than answer Starkey, Shiro sensed it when Haribel's focus shifted onto him for a reply she herself was unsure of. Now that he looked beside him, Starkey and Nell were the same. We wait, he said more for himself than everyone else. Eisen's making preparations. Haribel, Starkey, and Nell nodded to his words while looking at the Shinigami. Whatever Eisen was doing, Haribel and the rest were clearly seeing something different from what he was. Honestly, he was never going to get used to the sight of everyone yelling or talking to air while Eisen smirked a distance away as everyone made fools of themselves. Of course, in this case, Aizen was careful to blend his illusions to match with whatever the Zero Squad was seeing, considering he'd yet to expose them to Kyuka Suijutsu. Ever the meticulous one, Aizen always seemed to know what he was doing and weeded out Kisokura Hara. Stark yawned into his palm again and didn't say anything else. He was content to just lie where he was while Haribal grunted after noticing Sung Sun, Apasai, and Mila Rose engage in profanities against a bald-headed Shinigami and his squad mates. "Say that again, you bald fuck. You think I'm scared of you? Go ahead, yeah bitch. Fight me. I'll even give you a free shot so we all know who started it." The voices carried in the wind, drawing the interest of Grimjo and the others who were rearing for any excuse to fight. Haribal's eyes narrowed, the thought of Apasai and the others jeopardizing whatever arrangement Shiro was working towards irking her as she was responsible by extension. "If you'll excuse me," she said flatly before disappearing in a burst of sonido. Stark was more than willing to let Haribal go. Admittedly, he was getting kind of tired with the way Haribal would silently chastise him for his leisurely attitude with Shiro. Though, it wasn't as if Shiro minded Stark's behavior. "Shut up. What do you mean I can't fight? I'm not a brat. So shut up." Stark's eyes abruptly opened in exasperation before he mechanically turned his gaze to the sight of Lilynet being held in the air by the scruff of her shirt by a frustrated Renji who was on the verge of losing his self-control. "Damn brat," Stark dusted himself off and stood up. At any other time, Shiro knew Stark well enough to know that he'd leave Lilynet be, considering the Shinigami would have to think twice before truly instigating violence. The main difference between the past and present was Coyote's distant stare prompting Stark to intervene on her behalf while Coyote's eyes remained trained on the Royal Guard and captains of note. Stark followed Haribal's example and disappeared in a buzz of sound in upturned white sand. Roughly alone, Shiro's attention shifted towards Nell, who was still standing in place while looking out into the distance. She appeared so lost in thought that she likely hadn't even noticed Stark and Haribal leave. "Nell," he called out to her just to make sure. "Is there something you want to talk about?" Hollows may be considered malefic and corrupted souls, but they could be just as expressive and self-doubtful as any individual. In Nell's case, she was a hollow that perhaps cared a bit too much, making a clear distinction between herself and beasts. Yes, actually," she dropped her reservations and sighed when she realized he would be able to tell if she lied. "Would you mind accompanying me for a bit? It will be easier to explain that way." He hummed. As far as he was concerned, any reason to help his allies would increase their survivability in the coming conflict with Wywak and the Quincy. He had no reason to refuse. This wasn't the sort of problem he pictured Nell would be having when he'd agreed to help her. Don't get him wrong. He had no qualms with aiding her, but his presence brought with it an untold amount of animosity and wariness when Nell led him to an isolated area designated for the Shinigami. It was far from where the bulk of the Shinigami had made their temporary resting grounds with their Kido, but it was close enough that all captains and the Royal Guard become aware of his presence the moment he arrived with Nell. If not for the apprehension the Shinigami had towards him, many may have tried to accost him for their own reasons. As it was, Shunsui warned the other captain not to act out of hand while the captain commander was out of commission. The Royal Guard, however, had no qualms with trying to approach him on the basis of friendly interaction. He didn't buy that gimmick from the beginning, and a ring of fiery pink light in the distance pointed at the direction of the Royal Guards indicated that Coyote shared the same opinion. The ground quaked from the gathering spiritual energy, the horizon itself shifting into a vibrant flickering haze congregated at a single point at the tip of Coyote's pistol. The blast wouldn't only encompass the Royal Guard, but every Shinigami behind them too, causing Shunsui's loose expression to harden. The choice of conflict was firmly placed on the shoulders of the Royal Guard, and inwardly, Shunsui was already disillusioned with them. Tensions rose, but Coyote just didn't care. Baragan, who was observing the scene much like the other inhabitants of Hueco Mundo, stood up on his throne, the miasma of death around him taking the likeness of a roaring skull. This alerted everyone else in Hueco Mundo of potential conflict. Is this truly necessary for just a peaceful quick introduction? Ichibe spoke up on behalf of the Royal Guard. No one answered, but the distinct click of Coyote pulling back her revolver's safety and channeling a further ring of power around her growing Zero was heard by all Shinigami. Might you not show conduct proper of a host? Ichibei's soft smile thinned into a frown of frustration. Shiro frowned. The fact that they were so insistent was already grounds for suspicion, and evidently, he wasn't the only one to think so. Beside Coyote, Starkey suddenly appeared, placed a hand on her shoulder, and merged with her to become a grey pelt coat. The effect was instantaneous. Pink shifted into a pastel purple that distorted the air by forcibly condensing the energy into the size of a small bullet. Sand quickly pushed out from beneath her and formed a growing crater as the bone helmet that covered one of Coyote's eyes formed a red target reticule in the dark space. Ichibei noticed the attention that his fellow Shinigami were directing at him. Shunsui firmly shook his head while Anohana remained deceptively neutral. By the time Lilynet appeared by Coyote intent on sharing her power and unleashing the second release, a decision had to be made. Ichibei grunted, raising a hand and sighing while ordering his unit to stand down and return to their camp. A flash of disappointment flashed across Baragan's hollow sockets, before he turned to look at the massive congregation of power Coyote had already gathered begin to dissipate. Truly it was a pity. To witness the full-powered shot of a legend of the past didn't come often. Seeing the situation diffuse, Shiro eased the energy he'd been gathering to shield his allies from harm. Aizen hadn't been wrong. In his world, he really would guarantee the safety of his friends, allies, and even associates to the best of his ability. It was only when the Royal Guard turned around did they notice the odd traces of spiritual energy dissipating into the air directly behind them. Grim features marked the expressions of the Shinigami that had witnessed what had appeared hovering in the blind spots of the Royal Guard. None had been able to sense them as they were created from the energy of the world itself, utterly undistinguishable to the senses. This time, there would be conflict. The fact that the Royal Guard had even taken such a risk despite the situation of the Shinigami wasn't something that was missed by the remaining captains. Shiro just continued on his way. Nell was leading him to a small cave by a dune of sand. She looked sheepish, almost regretful that she didn't take the reaction of his presence under consideration when she'd asked him to accompany her. "Sorry," she muttered lowly, eyes glancing anywhere but at him for the lack of judgment. "I've been distracted as of late." Shiro raised a brow. "You haven't exactly explained anything yet." Nell scratched her cheek with her index finger. "About that, it all began when I decided to take another companion like Pesha and Dondakaka. His name was Ichigo. He had heart, and his potential was promising. He is a hollow. I'm sure of it." Nell nodded to herself. "His energy, his instinct, they're all there, but recent events have me doubting. Unlike most hollows, he fully remembers his past life, friends, and even family. Silent. They're related, and Silent's been remembering past memories too." Nell stopped just meters away from the cave's entrance. "Even if they're different from what was expected, they're still comrades, right?" Shiro didn't answer right away. He could understand what Nell was feeling. She was Ichigo's mentor as a hollow, and much like hollows who move in pacts, they trust each other or develop bonds. Haribel, Apasai, Mila Rose, and Sung Sun were the best example of this. Yet, what if Ichigo wasn't truly a hollow? Would he strike her down the moment she turned her back on him like the Shinigami who hunted hollows and made use of their weaknesses? "Is your bond so fragile?" Shiro asked instead. Nell clammed up at the question, recalling prior events and her thoughts on Ichigo. She clenched her hands into fists. "I believe it isn't. Even lost in rage in the battle in that fake dimension, he didn't harm me on instinct alone. I was pack in his eyes." Nell took in a breath and resolved herself. "Pack doesn't abandon pack. Pesha and Dondakaka would never abandon me, and I them." A good answer. Shiro found himself momentarily struck by Nell's strength of character. Hollow or not, she was a better person than even the Shinigami tasked with hunting her. "Then what is it that you need of me?" He stared at Nell as she resolutely stared into his eyes with a small smile tugging at her lips. "Reassurance that I'm not doing something stupid. I already know what the others would think, and there's no way I'd ask Aizen. Of all people, I felt like you'd be able to understand." And he did. He watched Nell slump her shoulders in what looked like relief that he hadn't told her she was wrong. "I guess, the best way I thought of convincing you is if you saw Ichigo yourself and gauged what sort of person he was," Nell continued to explain. "Hence, here we are." Though I don't believe we're quite welcome. This was an understatement. The both of them could sense the spiritual energy in the cave spike after detecting their presence. The first one to greet them with a glare while holding her sword in a tense grip was Karen Kurosaki. She froze in what could have only had been abject shock and terror at Shiro's presence, or lack of thereof, as she couldn't feel anything despite his presence surrounding her. His spiritual signature was the entirety of Hueco Mundo itself. She staggered back, eyes dilating and mouth opening inaudibly. It could be sensed through intuition. If Karen fought, there was no chance of winning. However, she managed to calm down just a smidgen when she noticed Nell. It's you," Karen stuttered, trying to remain strong, but giving herself away by the trembling of her sword. "You're the one who helped Ichigo and stood up to shelter everyone with Mom." Nell simply nodded, doing her best to appear disarming, a feat made easier as an errand car with a human appearance. "May we come in?" I brought a friend." Something in Karen's terrified and wary eyes screamed that Nell had brought more than just a mere friend. This was the head honcho. Stiffly nodding her head, Karen began leading the two inside, knowing that resistance was futile no matter how sheepish Nell appeared, that this was basically forcing their way in. Karen's lack of attitude and quietness alerted everyone inside the cave that something was distinctly wrong. Shiro observed the way faces turned pale and breaths hitched at his appearance. He noticed an odd group of humans, one a Quincy, the other with orange hair, and what looked like an entire crew of school students taking everything in. Silent was blinking owlishly at him from beside a captain-level Shinigami he didn't know, and other than her and Nell, everyone seemed on edge. It was in the midst of his observation that he was violently and unexpectedly accosted by an enraged woman, followed by a frantic younger brother telling her she was being crazy. Braun's eyes stared into defiant green on the verge of snapping. "You bastard! Where is Kion?" The room fell into muted silence. The balls on this woman to grab the Vasto of White by the scruff of the neck and shake him down. Ganju paled while screaming inaudibly, expression cringing. He pulled Kyokaku back with a hand muffled over her mouth to prevent her from spewing any profanities. It was with a strength born from fear that for the first time, Ganju overpowered his elder sister and dragged her to a different part of the cave to restrain her. The sound of the two scuffling echoed in the cave's resonant walls. Nell looked awkward while Silent moved to fix the now torn fabric of the white hakama Shiro wore while wordlessly pleading with her face to pretend as if nothing had happened. Nell suddenly shuddered to think about how Haribal would have reacted to such disrespect in her place. Shiro raised his hand, watching the way everyone either cowered or readied their weapons, before scratching the back of his head while sighing. "Honestly, that wasn't the first time that's happened to me," he said in the most resigned tone he could muster. "I swear it's always the forceful or strong women that get their way." Karen, Ishida, Orium, Tatsuki, Chad, and everyone else excluding Nell and Silent felt perplexed or just downright confused as the tension gradually bled away. Beyond the image of power and prestige the Vasto of White carried, was Shiro's true persona, a simple man who took joy from helping others. It was in this moment as other gawked that the unconscious teenager that had once been resting on Silent's lap groggily opened his eyes. Based on how Nell was looking at the teenager, Shiro confirmed an observation. This must be Ichigo Kurosaki. For a moment, the two just stared, silently observing the other and noting their own similarities. For the first time, the paths of two protectors had crossed. One created a hollow Shiro Emiya. The other, a human. Ichigo Kurosaki. Chapter 60. They were wary of him. This much was clear as Shiro observed Ishine Kurosaki herding several humans behind him. Meanwhile, Ishida, Chad, and Karen joined Ishine by positioning themselves on either side of the man in the case of confrontation. Of everyone present, only Nell and Silent appeared the most comfortable while the continued yelling of the two Shiba clan siblings echoed from another part of the cave. "Sorry, I didn't expect there to be so many around," Nell whispered to him with a wry smile at his side. He shook his head in a gesture to deny Nell's apology, but every single one of his actions was being heavily scrutinized by those in front of him. It was a known fact that he could send out spiritual blades with a simple movement, so by the time he directed his attention away from Nell, Ishine, Karen, and everyone else were firmly gripping their respective weapons. "Ugh, I feel sick. What's going on?" A voice broke through the tense standoff as Ichigo cradled his head from a bout of nausea. Nell. He then called out a second later. From beside him, Shiro watched a brief shift in Nell's expression when Ichigo hadn't called out to her with any animosity. Instead, there was a kind of relief in his tone that couldn't be faked, which allowed Nell's features to soften. With Ichigo waking up, it was like a thread had been cut and the reservations that had been bottled up within everyone all burst out at once. Ichigo, what the hell is going on? What happened to you? Before Ishine or anyone else could stop them, Tatsuki, Chizuru, Mizuho, and Kigo bolted towards Ichigo's resting place with Tatsuki in the lead. Though Ichigo didn't look entirely human with paler skin and horns jutting out from his head, his facial features were recognizable. Shiro watched as Tatsuki and the others surrounded Ichigo with concern, a vague sense of nostalgia assailing him at the scene. He once knew of a man who would constantly plunge himself into danger, and every time he would return to the people who constantly fretted over him like it was some sort of ritual. Then one day, the man failed to return. Shiro sighed before plopping himself down on the ground into a seated position with his legs crossed. The times were simpler back in another life, but in this one, he found himself saddled with a position of power where others relied on him. Though at times it was taxing, but once again, he'd formed bonds with those around him. To protect those that he held dear was his purpose in this afterlife after dying a hero in another time. The dream of saving everyone was impossible to fully realize simply because the act of saving one person may endanger another. There was no war or conflict where one side wouldn't take damage, and so what he'd come to do was help those who he could. As Shiro Emiya, no, as the Vasto of White, he had a duty to uphold with the same honor and righteousness of a distant king of his past. Ichigo Kurosaki, he called out, adopting the tone and manner of speech of a dear individual. I believe that this is our first meeting. The others tensed up once again as soon as he spoke, much to Nell, Silent, and even Orium's chagrin. A cat that had been lounging on the other side of the cave licked its paws and seemed to hum lightly. Ichigo made no outward signs of hostility, and in fact, he looked a tad embarrassed at the way his friends and family were acting. Ichigo's time with Nell and in Hueco Mundo in general wasn't something that he could just forget. Like Shiro had said to Nell before, was the strength of the bonds Ichigo had made to her and the hollows in Hueco Mundo really that weak? These were words spoken out of experience. It wasn't the first time for Shiro that enemies could become friends or allies. At the very least, Ichigo appeared to be someone that Shiro felt like he understood on a fundamental level because in a way, weren't they the same? Guys, calm down, Ichigo tried to mediate, his hands going up to placate in a manner Shiro recognized himself once using. Meanwhile, Shiro observed Tatsuki and the others watching curiously. Unlike everyone present, Tatsuki and the others had no relation to the affairs between Hollows, Shinigami, and Quincy. Speaking of which, who was the girl attached to Silent? A light brown-haired middle school girl in a thin hoodie and skirt was currently hiding behind Silent and out of sight from Ichigo. However, the moment Ichigo had spoken, the girl had been peeking over Silent's side, eventually catching Ichigo's attention. Yuza? What are you? Ichigo's words abruptly cut off when he noticed just who Yuza was hiding behind. Mom. Mom. Tatsuki echoed Ichigo's words before following Ichigo's gaze and stiffening as old memories resurfaced. Mrs. Kurosaki. Shiro hummed in thought. The simple interaction between Ichigo, Tatsuki, and the expressions of everyone around explained to him the reason for Silent's behaviors as of late. Still, he coughed into his hand, drawing everyone's attention. It's been quite a long time since anyone's dared to openly ignore him in Hueco Mundo. We were talking. He got straight to the point. Ichigo looked sheepish, but his gaze would constantly flicker back to Silent, then to Ishine, then to everyone else around him. Despite the perpetual scowl on Ichigo's face, he was clearly fidgeting when everyone continued to display hostility. As Ichigo had lived in Hueco Mundo for a time, he knew full well about Shiro's strength simply because every hollow he'd ever met in Hueco Mundo talked of it. Moreover, Nell was around and if conflict occurs, he would once again have to choose between one side and the other. Why is everyone being so mean? Orium of all people suddenly spoke up with a disarming smile that didn't seem practiced at all. Her natural cheer had this sort of calming effect that had nothing to do with the fact that she'd erected a healing barrier around Ichigo in the case of remedying any missed injuries. She then looked somewhat hesitantly at Shiro. You aren't here to cause any trouble, are you? No, Shiro answered. See. Orium clapped her hands together before pouting at Ishine, Karen, Ishida, and everyone else who were being too high-strung. The recipients of her gaze all huffed and turned to the side. Let's all just get along. At Orium's beckoning, hostilities were grudgingly placed aside as Shiro nodded. You have my thanks, he said kindly to Orium, who smiled at the ground. No, there's no need. I just feel that you don't seem to be a bad person. Orium explained. Shiro didn't bring it up, but he could practically see the place Orium held in Nell's eyes gradually elevating. Good. At least someone understands, she huffed. Nell may have been putting up with Ishine, and the rest due to their connection with Ichigo, but it didn't mean that she trusted them, at least not all of them. Nell glanced at Silent and Yuza before easing her posture into a more relaxed position. Well. Nell turned to Shiro. What do you think? She asked him. Shiro hummed and thought. In his observation of Ichigo and the rest, he could see why Nell may have taken special considerations. However, at the end of the day, she was skirting around the issue that was the most important and leaving it to him. This wouldn't solve anything. I think that you know exactly what you are doing. Is there any point delaying? Nell pursed her lips before slumping in front of everyone. Actually, Shiro's here because of me, Nell spoke up while looking intently at Ichigo and ignoring everyone else. I'm still not certain about how to feel about all this. The implied this were all the additional people around Ichigo. And I wanted someone I could trust around to prevent me from making a mistake by acting out on emotion. Nell steeled her features and some of the emotions she'd been repressing came to the surface as a hint of betrayal flickered across her eyes. You tricked me into training you? Into thinking you were my friend, a member of the pack. She sounded anxious, but if anything, the way Ichigo widened his eyes at the accusation was more noticeable. And even now, you're using me to shield you from the heat of the others. I trusted you, and it pains me to admit that I still trust you despite what you did in the last battle. Nell balled her hands into fists. Did you never treat anyone here, Pesha, Dondakaka, Lilynet, or the other Hollows as comrades that you nearly killed a friend to save the life of an enemy? No. Ichigo denied firmly, scratching at his hair in frustration. I didn't plan for any of this. My decisions had nothing to do with deceiving anyone, nor did I intend to kill. I used too much strength at the time, and I did my best to fix things. And that's why. Nell's nails dug into her palms, mixed feeling contorting her features into a grimace. If you were going to betray me and everyone else, then betray us. What traitor tries to protect the people he betrayed? It makes no sense. It makes me want to believe in you, and there's a limit to what help I can provide. Ichigo shut his mouth uneasily. No one in the room was a fool, and they could understand what Nell was getting at. Ichigo could only sit on the fence bordering either side for so long before he had to make a choice. The problem was, he had friends on either side and he wasn't willing to sacrifice anyone. Nell, Ichigo called out, but Nell's expression remained adamant, her lips pursed. Forget it, Nell shook her head. Just answer me this one question. Ichigo suddenly felt an ill foreboding. If the Shinigami or your friends create conflict, will you interfere again? Will you strike me down by the back? There was a tremble in Nell's tone, but the resignation already pervading it made it so that Ichigo couldn't tell. Silence pervaded the room. No matter how curious Tatsuki, Kigo, Chizuru, and everyone else was, they didn't speak because Ichigo looked utterly torn on how to answer. No matter how long Nell waited for a reply, none came from Ichigo, who swallowed and glanced away. Nell's features grew colder and colder as a sense of helplessness and betrayal assailed her. Enough was enough, however, and Shiro never liked oppressive moods. Then why not save both? It was a bit hypocritical of him to say this in his current position, but once upon a time, a certain fool adamantly stuck to this single option. The others looked at Shiro in a daze, Nell more so, and Ichigo looked like he'd found the solution to an unsolvable question. Enemies? Friends? With your own hands, What's the problem in saving both? If you can't save everyone or take a side, then what's wrong with saving those that matter to you the most and remaining neutral? Shiro continued. Shiro, are you really? She trailed off as Shiro raised a hand. He could already understand what she was implying, but there was no need for concern. Instead, he focused on Ichigo. What's your reason to protect? He asked. For me, I use my strength in order to guard those I care about. I invaded the Soul Society because a friend of mine was taken. I fought against the Shinigami because they actively sought to kill me and those that I hold dear. If your reason to protect those close to you is the same as mine, then there shouldn't be any problems anyway because I'm not the villain your compatriots think that I am. Ichigo opened, then closed his mouth before smiling wryly. For the first time, Ichigo felt like he could understand why all the hollows that follow the Vasto of White seemed to respect him so much because that same admiration was now running through him. You're a good man, he said with a relieved expression that matched Nell's own. I don't buy it, another voice intervened. Daeod, Karen drawled sharply like she was dealing with an idiot, her elbow jutting into his hind's side. Nell gritted her teeth, anger marring her features as spiritual pressure exuded off from her. You dare doubt my king's sincerity. You really aren't one for words, are you, Ishine? The black cat silently lounging in the corner suddenly spoke up. What the idiot really means, is that he doesn't buy that you're in your right state of mind. The cat's eyes suddenly narrowed. Have you perchance seen Aizen's Zanpakuto? Shiro didn't much for the answer. He was never a liar to begin with. Yes, he admitted. At the time he'd introduced it as a water type. Ishine and the black cat suddenly made eye contact. Whatever you say or think can't be trusted, Ishine grumbled much to Nell's growing irritation while Ichigo joined Karen at trying to shush their father. Because of Aizen. Shiro got right to the point, watching the way Ishine and the black cat glowered at the name. Their reactions were understandable considering his own prior reservations about Aizen, but there was more to people than just assumptions based on their actions. In a way, he alone likely understood Aizen the best due to his connection with Kyuka Suijutsu. This was why he could see this next statement with absolute certainty even if he and the Shinigami stood on opposite sides. Right now, Aizen isn't your enemy, he said firmly to their faces. In fact, he would likely be one of your strongest allies. Aizen's goal had always been the Soul King and the Soul King's palace. Now that Wiwak had usurped those very goals, Aizen's retaliation was all but guaranteed. If Aizen was terrifying as an enemy, then as a friend, he was an absolute pillar that could support the sky even should it fall. The matter could be denied by anyone all that they want, but it didn't change the position of Aizen's stance on the current matter. Did no one else find it odd that Aizen of all people had helped create a situation to allow the Shinigami to recover in Hueco Mundo? Aizen would never take action without reason, less so if any demerits were involved. That's enough, Ishine, the black cat murmured, disheartened. I thought you said you would focus on your family first. Ishine grumbled, but made sure to place himself between Shiro, Nell, and everyone else. If Shiro had anything else to say in this moment, he didn't say it as a tingle at the back of his neck shifted into a piercing stab. Is something wrong? Nell called out from his side. I've already said what needs to be said, and verified what needs to be verified. The choices you all make now will carry their own weight without prejudice, he said before grunting. If you'll excuse me. He winced before standing up and walking towards the exit of the cave. The pressure building at the back of his neck was growing more and more oppressive as time passed on. Nell, having noticed his discomfort, stood up to follow while biting down on her lower lip. Are you all right? She asked again. He didn't answer. This matter wasn't something that he could just explain anyway. Once outside the cave, he glanced up at the sky outside, frowning. The moonlit sky was becoming translucent like a layer of film over a globe peering into the skies of the human world. It alarmed everyone who could see it happening, but him who remained composed. How long had it been since the Shinigami arrived? There was no day and night cycle in Hueco Mundo, so all he had to judge the passing of time was his own internal clock. Perhaps it had roughly been a day or two. The Shinigami had only just begun to settle in and tensions were still high with the various Arrancar and Espada. For a man who's waited 1,000 years, you sure are impatient, Shiro muttered grimly. There was only one other person in existence in this current world that could directly affect his reality marble. Hovering above the translucent film around Hueco Mundo was an avatar or manifestation of Waiwak. Different from before, several thick layers of dark shadows lined with numerous eyes coated his body and created a mask over the upper half of his face. If Shiro could see Waiwak, then everyone else could too. The pressure Shiro had been feeling was Waiwak exerting power to influence the boundaries of his reality marble. Without hesitation, he ascended into the air while the others watched on in trepidation. The Shinigami stared at Waiwaka's figure with sorrow-tinted rage, while the royal guard openly grimaced. Even Aizen, the Aaron-Car, and Espada and Hueco Mundo couldn't help but evaluate the level of pressure Waiwak exuded with his presence alone. Waiwaka's strength was indisputable at this moment, with no one able to rival him after his assimilation with the Soul King. Aizen had to bitterly concede this point. In the face of said pressure, Shiro's form rising to meet Waiwak couldn't be ignored, nor could the very real thought that he might lose not surface in their minds. A buzz of sonido caused Shiro to momentarily halt his advance before he felt a tug on the sleeve of the white shiakusho he wore. Stark. It was strange how just one word could carry so much emotion, and only one person in Hueco Mundo adamantly called him by that name. Coyote, he said while turning to face the woman who regarded him as family. Her expression was as neutral as always, but the trembling of her hand grasping onto him gave away any facade of calm she had. She'd lost him once, and there was no way she could endure a second time. Several others could have easily come with her, but grudgingly chose not to after considering the fact that they may prove a liability to him in this battle rather than an asset. It was a show of Coyote's own self-confidence that she'd come, but oddly enough, Coyote wasn't alone. Ulquiorra, he called out while staring at the nihilistic hollow Aizen had recruited to his cause. Their intentions by approaching him now were clear. They wished to accompany him, but regardless, he couldn't allow them to. Stay here, he told them solemnly. This was something that only he could do while the others trained in order to grow stronger. I can help. Coyote frowned while Ulquiorra chose to remain silent. He shook his head, a brief flash of panic twisting Coyote's features into a grimace as she spun him around to face her directly. I am strong, she insisted. His continued silence, however, indicated to Coyote that she still wasn't strong enough. This battle was between those who could affect worlds with their thoughts and actions. Overwhelming power can only go so far against the laws governed by higher entities. And you? Shiro questioned Ulquiorra while Coyote gnashed her teeth in frustration. I already have a second release. I see no reason to waste time trying to pursue it, Ulquiorra answered frankly in monotone. There is also something I wish to learn in observing you. Shiro considered Ulquiorra's words, but once again shook his head to both of them. Instead, he had something else in mind rather than saying that they were still too weak. I need you both to stay and to keep watch over the Shinigami, he explained despite knowing that the two could tell that he only saying this in consolation. Still, neither called him out on it and let him continue. The members they call the Royal Guard may cause trouble in my absence, that's why I need you both to stay. Coyote didn't respond. She still felt bitter that it was implied that neither she nor Ulquiorra were strong enough to help in the first place. Stark, please. She looked at him straight in the eyes and revealed her concern for him on her face. The way her lips quivered and her eyes dilated in grief nearly swayed him, but the thought of putting her in danger still won out in the end. Just this once, trust in me one more time. He hugged her, wrapping his arms over her shoulders and leaning his neck against hers. I will return. He pulled away, and before she could argue, he accelerated far away from her. None of Shiro's allies had the qualifications to truly join him in this battle, and it was stifling. This emotion of powerlessness they could feel was one that they would remember so that it would never happen again. Ironically, this was the first time Coyote had ever felt the desire to grow stronger. Coyote tightly balled her hands into fists much like all those who watched from Hueco Mundo's sands. How frustrating. Wind blew violently high above the clouds, yet Shiro hardly batted an eye as he stopped 50 meters away from where Waiwak hovered above Hueco Mundo's dome. You came, Waiwak called out, neither prideful or overbearing. Oddly enough, It didn't seem like he'd come to start a fight despite pressing his energy against Hueco Mundo's boundaries. Do you really think that these swords mean nothing? Shiro gestured to the numerous weapons surrounding Hueco Mundo directed towards the star-shaped palace above. Each was packed with dense spiritual energy, two of which were divine constructs of Sumerian mythology, Ig Alama and Sursagana. The power they gave off was several times more imposing than the rest. Do I look like I fear you? Wywak challenged without batting an eye. This body is simply a manifestation of spiritual energy. Admittedly, I'm still in the process of consolidating my father's power, and as such can't do much else. Would this not be the best time to stop me? It actually depends. Shiro didn't deign to give an answer though. There was no way Wywak wouldn't have prepared to guard against him or the Shinigami for that matter. Besides, as much as the Shinigami would jump at the chance to defeat Wywak before he could fully assimilate the Soul King's power, the issue wasn't as pressing now that they had an alternative. They're using you, you know. You are a fool to shelter them, Wywak mused aloud. Even now, that conceited Ichibe may already be conspiring against you. There was merit in Wywak's words, but there was no way Wywak would care about any misfortune that could befall an enemy. What did you come here for? He was blunt, his words accompanied by a swell of spiritual energy that jolted every sword around Hueco Mundo into action. I find myself at an impasse. There was an air of grudging respect around Wywak's person. This moment should be where I declare my victory and the completion of the 1,000 years blood feud, but here I stand now against a brother who too is able to control the laws of their world. I care not if you were a bastard son, but you are standing in the way of a new world order beyond the realms of the human world, Soul Society, and Hueco Mundo. Shiro grunted, his muscles tensing as he sensed the ill intentions in Wywak's words. So, you did come to start a fight. He grasped at invisible hilts and scrutinized Wywak's every action. No, Wywak shook his head before sizing Shiro up. This is a declaration of war. Shameful as it is to admit, I'm not your match outside the Star Palace until I can fully assimilate Father's power, but why should I allow my enemies time to regroup? It would seem that there's even an old foe who shouldn't be alive. Shiro's expression hardened as an oppressive energy exuded from Wywak, producing a blanket of shadows that sought not to destroy Hueco Mundo, but to ravage and kill those within. It was primarily directed at the Shinigami, but there was no way that it wouldn't affect other hollows nearby. Hueco Mundo was an inactive world. It was far from the true world that was his reality marble, which allowed others to freely access it using Garganta or other means. This was to say, Wywak had no trouble bypassing Hueco Mundo's outer layer. From within Hueco Mundo, a dense black fog that blotted out the sky rapidly descended on the area the Shinigami stayed. However, the fog halted and abruptly dissipated in a flurry of black key-like blades. Above Hueco Mundo, Wywak staggered back as a cut had appeared over his chest. He was bleeding profusely, but the man seemed unbothered as this wasn't his actual body. Do you really wish to go so far for those who would condemn you? They were too close, was his only reply. Too close. Wywak repeated the words with a frown before he understood just who Shiro had been referring to. A king of hollows who cares for the safety of their subjects? You're too soft. There's no use in intervening anyway, Wywak chastised with a hint of grim amusement. A clash between us will result in mutual destruction of the world around us, making your actions to protect them meaningless. I'm confident that I can defend against you in my domain, and I'm certain that you are too. But whereas I guard an empty palace, you shelter many. Unperturbed, Shiro readied himself for combat in the skies of Hueco Mundo. Then come. I will welcome you. A boisterous laugh echoed before Wywak hovered further back then pressed forward. The moment I set foot in Hueco Mundo will be the moment I fall under your influence, but it's vice versa and you know it. Why don't you visit my palace instead? Right now, there's no meaning to falling to your provocation, but everything changes when I consolidate Father's power. You're right on your accounts, Shiro conceded calmly. But you're wrong in that you've neglected the most important variable. He could very well storm Wywak's domain before the man could assimilate the Soul King's full power, but like Wywak had said, it may result in a tie due to their control over their respective dimensions. There was only one way to end a tie. If two sides are even, then a single push will decide the difference between victory and defeat. Waiwak paused in consideration before a glint appeared in his eyes when he noticed the faces of those staring at Shiro from Hueco Mundo. Do you truly put that much faith in your followers? Waiwak asked lightly before reeling in his spiritual energy. Can they really amount to anything in the short term? How much time do you wish to buy them to grow stronger? Days, weeks, regardless, isn't this interesting? Shiro didn't much agree with the statement, but Waiwak had his own considerations and continued. If I must wait to consolidate my powers anyway, shall we make a wager then? Your forces against my stern ritter. Waiwak began to note details. Shiro was listening, and showed no signs of interrupting. After all, his side had many dear ones he trusted. Moreover, his side had an Aizen can make a fool out of anyone. Check the description for the links to the author.